The slap changed everything.
You do not tell me no!
Daniela stood frozen, stunned and deeply hurt, unable to understand why she had been slapped for simply doing her job.
Did anyone see that?
Her badge became a weapon.
People in your position should know better.
She had only followed protocol.
This corridor is restricted. Please return to reception.
Helen knew the truth.
She was helping me.
Vivian's lie found protection.
Get her out of my hospital. I never want to see her here again.
I'll handle it.
No one asked why.
You took my badge, but you never asked if I was hurt.
Silence followed her out.
I am sorry.
Then she called Samuel.
Samuel, they took my badge. They threw me out.
But it had begun earlier. Earlier that day, a chain reaction collision on the interstate had brought more than 20 injured people through the hospital doors in less than an hour. The trauma bays filled first, then the recovery rooms, then every space that could safely hold a patient with monitoring equipment. Nurses were called from outpatient services, surgical recovery, and specialty clinics. Doctors who had expected routine consultations found themselves treating internal bleeding, fractured ribs, head injuries, and terrified children separated from their parents. The hospital was not merely busy, it was stretched to its edge. In the middle of that crisis, Vivian Hollis arrived for a procedure that was never meant to be urgent. Vivian was 61 years old, immaculately dressed, sharply composed, and accustomed to entering rooms as though they had been built for her. Her family name appeared on plaques throughout the city. The Hollis Foundation had funded scholarship programs, museum exhibits, political campaigns, and hospital projects. 3 years earlier, the foundation had pledged several $1 million to St. Alden for a pediatric expansion that had not yet been completed. To most people in the hospital, Vivian was not just a donor. She was a force. The staff knew that her complaints reached the executive offices faster than emergency calls reached certain departments. They knew she had private contact numbers for members of the board. They knew that when Vivian Hollis was unhappy, someone usually found a way to make the problem disappear. That afternoon, the problem was supposed to be Daniela. Vivian had been scheduled for a minor cosmetic dermatology procedure in the outpatient wing. It was not dangerous. It was not time-sensitive. It could have been performed another day without any risk to her health. But the procedure required a small recovery area, nursing support, and a team that had suddenly been reassigned to patients coming out of emergency surgery. Daniela had been asked to help coordinate the delays. She approached Vivian with the same professionalism she gave every patient. She explained that the hospital was responding to a mass casualty event and that several staff members needed for Vivian's appointment had been pulled into critical care. She assured her that the procedure would be rescheduled quickly and that the medical team would contact her personally once the crisis had stabilized. It should have been a simple explanation. Instead, Vivian stared at Daniela as though she had been personally insulted. At first, Vivian spoke in the controlled, polished tone of someone who wanted to make sure everyone nearby understood that she believed herself to be above the inconvenience. She questioned why a hospital that had accepted millions from her family could not find one nurse and one room for a procedure that had been scheduled weeks earlier. Daniela explained again that patients with life-threatening injuries were being prioritized. That was when Vivian's expression changed. Her words became colder. Her patience became theatrical. She made comments about Daniela's manner, her accent, and the idea that someone in Daniela's position had the authority to tell her no. She did not need to shout at first. Her contempt was sharper when delivered quietly. Daniela had dealt with angry families before. She had been blamed for wait times she could not control, for outcomes she could not change, and for rules she did not create. She understood that fear often made people cruel, but Vivian was not afraid. Vivian was offended. There was a difference. Daniela stayed calm. She did not argue. She did not raise her voice. She simply repeated the truth that mattered most. The hospital had limited resources at that moment, and those resources had to go to the patients whose lives depended on them. Vivian seemed almost stunned that the answer did not change. To her, money had always changed answers. When she realized Daniela would not bend, Vivian removed her phone from her handbag and called Graham Mercer. Graham was the chief operating officer of St. Alden Regional. He had spent years building a reputation as a polished administrator who could calm donors, impress board members, and make difficult situations look manageable. He was known for speaking about integrity in public meetings and efficiency in private ones. But inside the hospital, people had learned that his definition of efficiency often depended on who was upset and how much influence that person had. He answered Vivian's call almost immediately. Daniela could hear only fragments of the conversation from where she stood, but she did not need to hear every word to understand what was happening. Vivian's tone was carefully wounded. She described herself as being mistreated. She framed Daniela's refusal to ignore triage rules as disrespect. She suggested that the hospital had forgotten who helped keep its doors open. Within minutes, Graham arrived in person. He did not ask what had happened in the emergency department. He did not ask how many trauma patients had arrived. He did not ask why Daniela had made the decision she did. He looked first at Vivian, then at Daniela, and it became clear that he had already chosen whose version of the story mattered. Graham took Daniela aside and told her that she would be moved temporarily to the third floor. The explanation sounded harmless on the surface. He said the situation had become tense and that it would be better for everyone if Daniela worked somewhere else for the remainder of the shift. But Daniela understood exactly what it was. It was punishment disguised as conflict management. She had followed the hospital's policies. She had protected emergency patients. She had spoken respectfully. Yet Graham was moving her because Vivian Hollis had complained. Daniela considered protesting. She considered asking him to put the order in writing. But a call came through about an elderly patient upstairs who needed assistance, and the emergency department remained overwhelmed. In that moment, she made the choice she always made when things were difficult. She put the patients first. She accepted the transfer and went upstairs. For the next 40 minutes, Daniela worked in the third-floor observation unit, helping nurses manage overflow from the emergency department. The patients there were not all critically injured, but many needed monitoring after surgery, after falls, or after sudden medical episodes that could become serious without warning. One of them was Helen Ward. Mrs. Ward was 78 years old and had come to St. Alden after becoming dizzy at home. Her daughter was stuck in traffic after the interstate accident, and Helen had been alone for most of the afternoon. She was frightened, but trying not to show it. Daniela noticed the way the woman kept watching the hallway each time footsteps passed, hoping someone familiar would appear. Daniela took a few extra minutes to explain what the doctors were monitoring. She adjusted the blanket around Helen's shoulders, made sure her call button was within reach, and promised that someone would keep her informed. To Daniela, it was a small act of care. To Helen, was the only moment that day when she felt like more than a chart number. That kindness would matter later. At the time, Daniela had no way of knowing that Vivian Hollis was moving through the same floor, angry that she had not been given the private route and private attention she believed she deserved. Vivian had been offered a quiet waiting area near the outpatient department while her procedure was formally postponed. But waiting was not something she accepted easily. She had left that area on her own, determined to find someone who would make the hospital's inconvenience disappear. A volunteer had told her that a private exit on the 3rd floor could lead more directly to the parking structure. The volunteer did not know that the route required going through a staff-only corridor. Vivian either did not hear the warning or did not care. When she stepped into the restricted hallway, she saw Daniela near Helen Ward's room. To a reasonable person, it would have looked like coincidence. To Vivian, it became proof of a story she had already invented. She saw the nurse who had refused her. She saw the same steady expression that had made her feel powerless downstairs. And in that moment, Vivian decided that Daniela's presence could not possibly be part of her work. It had to be defiance. Daniela noticed Vivian before Vivian spoke. She recognized the sound of expensive heels against the polished hospital floor. She turned and saw the woman standing near the restricted access sign, her face tense with anger. Daniela did not accuse her. She did not make a scene. She simply reminded Vivian that she was in a staff-only area and offered to help her return to the public corridor. That should have ended it. But Vivian had already crossed the line where reason mattered. She began raising her voice. She accused Daniela of following her. She suggested that Daniela had been waiting for a chance to embarrass her again. Her words were loud enough to draw attention from nearby rooms and the nurses' station. Daniela tried to keep the situation contained. She told Vivian that she was assigned to the 3rd floor and had been there since being moved by administration. She said that the hallway was restricted for patient safety and that Vivian needed to leave the area. Vivian did not want an explanation. She wanted a target. She stepped closer. The air in the corridor seemed to change. People began to watch, but no one stepped forward. The orderly with the linens stopped near the wall. A respiratory therapist paused outside a room. Dr. Megan Blake emerged from the charting station with a look of concern, then hesitation. Vivian reached for Daniela's hospital badge. The motion was so sudden that Daniela barely had time to react. Vivian pulled the badge free from its clip, looked at Daniela's name, then held it as though it were proof that she had the right person. She accused Daniela of harassing a donor. She accused her of making threats. She accused her of disrespecting the hospital. None of it was true. Daniela did not shout back. She did not try to grab the badge. She did not even defend herself in the way Vivian seemed to expect. The restraint on Daniela's face only seemed to make Vivian angrier, because there was nothing she could use as evidence of aggression. So she created it. The slap came fast. It was hard enough to turn Daniela's head to the side. Helen Ward saw it from the doorway of her room. Dr. Megan Blake saw it from only a few feet away. The orderly saw it. The respiratory therapist saw it. The nurses near the station saw it. Several people saw the exact moment Vivian became the aggressor. And yet, in the first seconds afterward, no one said a word. Daniela slowly turned back toward Vivian. One hand rose to her cheek, not dramatically, not with anger, but almost as though she needed to confirm what had just happened. Vivian stood there breathing heavily, looking less ashamed than triumphant. She knew what her money had bought her in the past. She knew that people often chose safety over truth. Then Graham Mercer arrived. No one knew who had called him. Perhaps Vivian had done it herself. Perhaps someone at the front desk had already alerted his office. Either way, he appeared with the speed of a man who understood that a powerful donor in distress could become a public relations disaster. He walked into the corridor, took one look at Vivian, and went directly to her. He asked if she was all right. He asked if she needed medical attention. He asked if anyone had made her feel unsafe. He did not ask Daniela why her cheek was red. He did not ask why Vivian was standing in a restricted hallway. He did not ask the people who had witnessed the incident what they had seen. Vivian told Graham that Daniela had confronted her again. She claimed that the nurse had followed her upstairs and behaved aggressively. She implied that she had only reacted because she felt threatened. Graham listened as though every word were already proven. Then he turned to Daniela. His expression was not angry. That would have been easier to understand. It was colder than anger. It was the expression of someone who had decided that one employee's dignity was an acceptable price for protecting a donor relationship. He asked Daniela to hand over her badge. For the first time that day, something inside her seemed to shift. Not because she was guilty, not because she believed anyone had the right to treat her this way, but because she realized the hospital was not even pretending to care about the truth. She handed him the badge. Graham informed her that she was being placed on administrative leave pending review. He did not say that Vivian had struck her. He did not mention witnesses. He did not say an investigation would begin immediately. He used careful language about avoiding further disruption and preserving the hospital's reputation. Reputation. That was what mattered. Not the nurse who had been assaulted. Not the patients who had watched adults fail them. Not the message sent to every staff member in the hallway who now understood that doing the right thing could cost them their job if the wrong person became offended. Graham instructed Daniela to leave through the employee exit near the parking garage. He said it would be better than walking through the main lobby while the situation was still sensitive. Daniela understood the real reason. He wanted her gone quietly. He wanted Vivian protected from questions. And he wanted the hospital to appear calm, even if calm had to be built on a lie. As Daniela walked toward the back exit, she passed the same people who had watched Vivian strike her. Some looked ashamed. Some looked frightened. Some could not meet her eyes at all. Dr. Megan Blake stood near the nurse's station, holding the patient file so tightly that the edges bent beneath her fingers. She looked like she wanted to say something. Daniela could see it in her face, but Megan remained silent. Lillian Park, the charge nurse on duty, was not in the hallway when the slap happened. She arrived minutes later and saw only the aftermath. Daniela without her badge, Vivian surrounded by administrators, and Graham speaking in the low, controlled tone he used when he wanted people to stop asking questions. Lillian had worked at St. Alden for more than 20 years. She had watched Graham reward obedience and punish resistance. She had seen nurses move to undesirable shifts after speaking too openly in meetings. She had seen staff members blamed for problems created by budget cuts. She had learned to protect herself by staying careful. But when she saw Daniela walking toward the employee exit with one hand pressed lightly against her cheek, something in Lillian's carefully built silence began to crack. Daniela did not cry in the hallway. She waited until she reached the parking garage. Outside, the late afternoon sun had started to fade behind the city buildings. Ambulances still arrived at the emergency entrance on the other side of the hospital. From where Daniela stood, she could hear distant sirens and the faint hum of traffic. Life was continuing as though nothing had happened. Her phone felt heavy in her hand. For several minutes, she did not call anyone. She sat in her car without starting it, staring at the badge clip still attached to her uniform even though the badge itself had been taken away. That small, empty piece of plastic seemed to say everything. 8 years of loyalty reduced to an absence. Eventually, she called Samuel Reed. Samuel was not a politician. He was not a lawyer. He was not someone who enjoyed using his title to intimidate people. He was a physician, the director of emergency services for Horizon Medical Alliance, one of the largest regional health systems in the state. He had spent most of his career working in emergency medicine, where decisions had to be made quickly, and where the difference between arrogance and competence could mean the difference between life and death. He understood pressure. He understood grief. He understood that hospitals could be flawed places run by people who were too tired, too ambitious, or too afraid. But when Daniela told him what had happened, he did not interrupt her with promises of revenge. He listened. She told him about Vivian's appointment. She told him about the interstate accident. She told him how Graham had moved her because Vivian was angry. She told him about the restricted hallway, the stolen badge, the slap, the silence, and the order to leave through the back. By the time she finished, Samuel was quiet for a long moment. He knew Daniela well enough to understand that she would not exaggerate. She was not someone who turned every insult into a crisis. She had spent years standing up for patients without making herself the center of the story. So when she said she had been treated like a criminal for following triage rules, he believed her. But Samuel also knew something Daniela was too hurt to think about at that moment. The next morning, he was scheduled to visit St. Alden Regional as part of Horizon's preliminary evaluation of a possible merger. Horizon had been considering whether to bring St. Alden into its network, a move that could mean new equipment, expanded trauma services, financial stability, and access to a larger regional system. St. Alden wanted that merger badly. Graham Mercer wanted it badly too. Samuel did not tell Daniela that he would use the visit to punish anyone. He did not promise that Vivian would regret what she had done. He did not suggest that his title could erase the humiliation Daniela had suffered. Instead, he reminded her of something she had told countless patients and families over the years. When the truth matters, details matter. He encouraged her to write down everything while it was fresh. The timeline, the names of witnesses, the location, the words Graham used, the fact that Vivian had entered a restricted corridor, the fact that Daniela had been transferred to that floor by Graham himself, the fact that no one had asked her for a statement before taking her badge. Daniela spent most of the night doing exactly that. She wrote slowly at first, then more steadily. The more she recorded, the clearer the pattern became. This was not only about one woman losing her temper. It was about a hospital administrator who had chosen a donor over a nurse before the assault had even happened. By midnight, Daniela had completed a formal complaint. She included no dramatic language, no insults, no threats, only facts. The next morning, Graham Mercer arrived at St. Alden, expecting to host an important meeting with Horizon Medical Alliance. He expected polished presentations, financial projections, and conversations about expansion. He expected to emphasize the hospital's strong community reputation and the promise of the pediatric wing the Hollis Foundation might help complete. Instead, he found Samuel Reed standing in the executive conference room. For a brief moment, Graham did not recognize him. Then he saw the name card on the table, and his face changed. Samuel was not there as Daniela's fiancé, at least not officially. He was there as Horizon's Director of Emergency Services and a senior member of the clinical evaluation team. Graham greeted him with the smooth confidence of an administrator who believed he still controlled the room. But Samuel's manner was different from what Graham expected. He was polite, professional, and calm. He asked about trauma capacity, staffing ratios, patient safety reporting, and the hospital's policies for protecting employees from workplace violence. At first, Graham answered as though the questions were routine. Then Samuel asked how St. Alden handled incidents in which staff members reported being assaulted by patients, visitors, or donors. The room became still. Graham gave the standard answer. He spoke about zero tolerance. He mentioned reporting procedures, security protocols, and employee support services. Samuel listened without reacting. Then he asked whether those procedures had been followed the previous afternoon. Graham's confidence began to fade. He did not yet know the full extent of Daniela's complaint. He did not know how much Samuel knew. He did not know whether the matter had already reached Horizon's legal and ethics teams. But he understood one thing. The nurse he had sent out through the back exit was not going to disappear quietly. And somewhere inside the hospital, in a corridor filled with cameras no one had bothered to review, the truth was waiting. The truth did not arrive at St. Alden Regional Hospital all at once. It came in pieces. First, it came through Daniela's written complaint, which was so precise that even Graham Mercer could not dismiss it as an emotional reaction. Daniela had documented the time Vivian Hollis arrived, the reason her procedure had been postponed, the fact that emergency resources had been diverted to victims of the interstate collision, and the order Graham gave to move her to the third floor. She listed the names of everyone she remembered seeing in the hallway after the assault. She described how Vivian had entered a restricted corridor, taken her badge, accused her of following her, and struck her in front of witnesses. Most importantly, Daniela included the part Graham had hoped she would leave out. She described how he had treated Vivian as the victim before anyone had even asked what happened. She described how he had taken her badge without hearing her account. She described how he had told her to leave through the employee exit, not because there was a safety concern, but because he wanted the incident to disappear before anyone in the main lobby had a chance to notice. Daniela did not use dramatic words. She did not call Graham corrupt. She did not call Vivian dangerous. She did not try to make herself sound heroic. She simply told the truth in the clearest way she knew how. And that was exactly what made the complaint difficult to bury. By mid-morning, the document had reached the hospital's Human Resources Department, the Internal Compliance Office, and the legal team responsible for reviewing workplace violence incidents. Normally, Graham would have found a way to slow the process down. He knew how institutions worked. He knew that paperwork could vanish into review cycles, that meetings could be postponed, and that people often became tired before the truth became inconvenient for the right people. But this time, the complaint had arrived on the same morning that Horizon Medical Alliance was evaluating St. Alden for a potential merger. That timing changed everything. Samuel Reed had already disclosed his personal relationship with Daniela to Horizon's ethics office before stepping into the conference room. He made it clear that he would not be involved in deciding whether Daniela's complaint was valid, whether discipline was appropriate, or whether the hospital should face legal consequences. He understood that Daniela deserved a fair investigation, not a favor disguised as justice. But he also made something else clear. Any hospital seeking to join Horizon's network would be evaluated not only on finances, equipment, and patient volume, but also on culture. A hospital could have polished floors, impressive fundraising brochures, and a long list of wealthy supporters, but none of that mattered if employees were afraid to report violence. None of it mattered if administrators allowed money to determine who received care and who received protection. To Samuel, the question was no longer whether St. Alden had a public relations problem. The question was whether St. Alden had a moral problem. Graham tried to answer with the language he knew best. He spoke about confusion. He mentioned that Vivian Hollis had felt threatened. He suggested that the situation had unfolded quickly and that everyone was still gathering facts. But the more carefully he spoke, the more obvious it became that he had never intended to gather facts at all. He had gathered influence. He had gathered fear. He had gathered the silence of people who believed that protecting themselves was safer than protecting the truth. Samuel did not argue with him. He did not need to. He simply asked that the meeting be paused while Horizon's clinical review team received an updated report on the hospital's employee safety policies, donor access procedures, and incident response records from the previous 12 months. That request sounded routine. For Graham, it was devastating, because St. Alden did have records, and records had a way of remembering what frightened people tried to forget. While the executive offices struggled to contain the growing problem, Lillian Park sat alone in a small staff lounge on the 3rd floor, staring at a cup of coffee that had gone cold an hour earlier. She had worked at St. Alden long enough to know how these situations usually ended. The person with the least power became the easiest person to blame. The employee who followed policy was called difficult. The patient, donor, or executive who caused the harm was treated carefully, gently, almost respectfully, as though their status had transformed bad behavior into a misunderstanding. Lillian had seen it happen before. Years earlier, a surgical technician had reported that a visiting physician was verbally abusive towards staff. The technician had been told that he was too sensitive. Another time, a nurse complained that a board member's family member had entered a restricted unit after visiting hours. The nurse was quietly moved to a less desirable schedule 2 weeks later. No one said the transfer was punishment, but everyone understood why it happened. Lillian had never forgotten those moments. She had also never forgiven herself for surviving them by staying quiet. When she saw Daniela leaving through the employee exit the afternoon before, something inside her had broken open. Daniela had not been reckless. She had not been rude. She had not gone looking for conflict. She had simply done what nurses were trained to do: protect the people whose needs were most urgent. And for that, she had been humiliated. Lillian opened her work laptop and began searching through staffing records. At first, she only intended to confirm Daniela's transfer to the 3rd floor. But as she reviewed the scheduling logs, she found something else. The transfer order had not been entered through the normal staffing system. Graham had called it in directly to the shift supervisor, bypassing the usual documentation process. There was no written concern about Daniela's performance, no formal complaint from Vivian, no safety note, no record that Daniela had done anything wrong. There was only the abrupt transfer. Then Lillian found an email from 3 months earlier. It had been sent by Graham to a small group of department managers. The message was brief, but its meaning was unmistakable. It instructed staff to make reasonable accommodations for Vivian Hollis and her family whenever possible, especially when they visited the hospital for non-emergency care. The email did not openly say that Vivian should be allowed to skip triage rules. It was more careful than that, but the wording left little room for interpretation. Graham had encouraged staff to treat the Hollis family as exceptional. In a hospital, exceptional treatment could become dangerous very quickly. Lillian read the message 3 times. Then she forwarded it to the compliance office. She added a statement of her own. For the first time in years, she did not soften the truth. She explained that Graham's approach had created a culture in which employees believed powerful donors could complain their way around medical policy. She described how staff members had learned to avoid conflict with Vivian even when her requests were unreasonable. She admitted that she had not spoken up sooner because she feared retaliation. Her hands shook as she pressed send, but after the message disappeared from her screen, Lillian felt something she had not felt in a long time. She felt lighter, not because the fear was gone, because she had finally stopped allowing fear to decide who she was. Across the hospital, Dr. Megan Blake was facing a different kind of battle. Megan had become a doctor because she believed medicine was an act of courage. She had imagined courage as the ability to work through exhaustion, make difficult diagnoses, deliver bad news, and stand steady when families were falling apart. She had not imagined that courage could also mean speaking when everyone around her was silent. The moment Vivian slapped Daniela had replayed in Megan's mind all night. Each time she remembered it, she saw something new. She saw the way Daniela had not moved toward Vivian. She saw the way Vivian grabbed the badge first. She saw the way Graham arrived and immediately turned his attention toward the woman with money instead of the nurse with a red mark across her face. Megan knew exactly what had happened, and she had said nothing. At first, she told herself that it was not her place. Then she told herself that security cameras would reveal the truth anyway. Then she told herself that she had patients to care for and could not risk creating more chaos. But beneath every excuse was the same ugly fact. She had been afraid. Megan had heard stories about Graham. Everyone had. She knew he had influence over staffing, promotions, and performance reviews. She knew he could make a person's work life miserable without ever saying anything that could be proven. But by the next morning, another thought had become impossible to ignore. Daniela had been afraid too, and Daniela had still done the right thing. Megan went to the compliance office and asked to provide a statement. At first, the investigator looked surprised. The official report from the previous day contained no mention of an assault. It only referred to a disagreement involving a donor and a staff member. But Megan spoke carefully and directly. She said she had witnessed Vivian strike Daniela. She said Daniela had not threatened Vivian or moved toward her. She said she saw Vivian pull Daniela's badge before the slap. Then Megan said the words that mattered most. She said that Graham had never asked her what she saw. The investigator wrote everything down. By early afternoon, the hallway that had been silent the day before was beginning to speak. Not loudly, not perfectly, but enough. The next witness came from a place no one expected. Mrs. Helen Ward had spent most of the day waiting for her daughter, who finally arrived after traffic from the interstate accident had eased. Helen had been tired, frightened, and overwhelmed by the hospital environment. But when she heard from a nurse that Daniela had been sent home after an incident, she immediately asked to speak with someone in charge. Helen did not know anything about Vivian Hollis. She did not know about the Hollis Foundation, the merger, or the executives meeting upstairs. She did not know Samuel Reed's title. She only knew what she had seen from her room. She told the investigator that Daniela had been kind to her when she felt alone. She described how the nurse had explained her condition, adjusted her blanket, and made sure she understood what was happening. Then she described the woman who entered the hallway angry and loud. Helen said Vivian had accused Daniela before Daniela had even spoken. She said she remembered hearing Vivian claim that Daniela had followed her, but Helen knew that was impossible because Daniela had been on the floor long before Vivian arrived. She had seen Daniela checking on patients, speaking with nurses, and helping near the observation rooms. Helen's statement did more than confirm the assault. It destroyed the story Vivian had tried to create, because it established that Daniela had not been following anyone. She had been working. Meanwhile, the security department was reviewing the cameras. Graham had assumed the hallway footage would be unclear. He remembered that the third-floor corridor had been under renovation months earlier, and he believed the camera near the restricted access sign had been removed or turned at an angle that would not capture the confrontation. What he did not know was that the hospital had upgraded several cameras after a previous incident involving an unauthorized visitor. The system had been designed to store footage automatically on an external server, not on equipment controlled by the local administration. That meant no one inside St. Alden could quietly erase it. The security supervisor, a man named Robert Kell, had worked at the hospital for 14 years. He was not easily impressed by wealthy visitors or executive pressure. His job had taught him that truth often looked different from the first story people told. When he reviewed the footage, he found exactly what everyone feared and hoped to see. Vivian entered the restricted corridor alone. Daniela was already there, assisting with patient care. Vivian approached Daniela first. Daniela did not chase her, threaten her, or block her way. She simply spoke to her from a respectful distance and gestured toward the public hallway. Then Vivian took Daniela's badge. Then Vivian slapped her. The camera did not capture every word clearly, but it captured enough. It captured the truth. Robert also pulled the access control logs. Vivian had not been authorized to enter the third-floor staff corridor. Daniela's badge had been scanned on that floor because Graham had ordered her transfer there. The timeline matched Daniela's complaint perfectly. The evidence was not emotional. It was not opinion. It was not influenced by money, fear, or reputation. It was time-stamped. And because it was time-stamped, it was almost impossible to deny. When the footage reached the compliance office, the tone of the investigation changed immediately. What had begun as a workplace complaint became a formal review of assault, retaliation, donor influence, and administrative misconduct. Vivian Hollis was contacted by the hospital's legal department and informed that the incident was under active investigation. At first, she reacted with disbelief. She insisted that Daniela had provoked her. She said she had felt threatened. She implied that the hospital was turning against her because a powerful outsider had become involved. But then she learned about the camera footage. For the first time, Vivian's certainty wavered. She had spent years believing that money protected her from consequences, not because she thought of herself as a villain, but because she had grown used to a world that rearranged itself around her. Restaurants found tables, offices returned calls. People apologized, even when she was the one who had behaved badly. She had mistaken accommodation for respect. She had mistaken fear for loyalty. And now, for the first time in a very long time, she was discovering that neither could change a recording. Graham Mercer reacted differently. Vivian was angry. Graham was terrified. He knew the video alone could end his career. But the deeper investigation threatened to expose more than one bad decision. As compliance officers reviewed emails, staffing records, donor access notes, and executive communications, they began to see a pattern. Graham had not merely tried to protect Vivian after the assault. He had been protecting her for years. The record showed that Vivian and her family had received access to appointment slots outside normal scheduling procedures. On several occasions, staff had been pressured to move other patients, sometimes without clear medical reasons. There were emails where Graham described the Hollis family as essential to the hospital's future and encouraged managers to avoid upsetting them under any circumstances. He had never written the words that made the arrangement illegal. He was too careful for that. But the intent was everywhere, in the unusually fast responses to Vivian's complaints, in the special treatment notes hidden inside administrative emails, in the way staff members were warned to be flexible whenever the Hollis name appeared, in the way Daniela had been moved without documentation, and in the way Graham had tried to send her out through the back door before anyone could ask questions. The investigation revealed something else that made the board even more alarmed. The Hollis Foundation had not actually completed the donation it had promised for the pediatric expansion. The public announcement had created the impression that the money was secure, but much of the pledge was still tied to conditions, deadlines, and naming rights negotiations. Graham had been behaving as though St. Alden already owed Vivian everything. In reality, the hospital had been bending itself around money it had not even received. That fact changed the atmosphere inside the boardroom. For months, the trustees had feared that challenging Vivian would jeopardize the hospital's future. But now they had to consider a harder question. What kind of future did they have if they allowed people with money to control medical decisions? By the end of the second day, the board called an emergency meeting. It was not public, not at first. The hospital's lawyers advised caution. There were employment laws, privacy concerns, possible criminal charges, and contractual obligations to review. But everyone in the room understood that the situation had moved beyond internal discipline. Daniela was invited to attend with a representative from the Nursing Association. She did not want Samuel beside her at the table, not because she did not appreciate him, but because she wanted the board to see her clearly, not as someone's fiancé, not as the person connected to Horizon Medical Alliance, not as a symbol of embarrassment for the hospital. She wanted them to see her as what she had always been, a nurse who had done her job. The meeting took place in a conference room on the top floor, a space with glass walls overlooking the city. It was the kind of room where people discussed budgets, expansion plans, and public image. On the walls hung framed photographs of groundbreaking ceremonies and smiling donors holding oversized checks. Daniela noticed those photographs when she entered. For a moment, she wondered how many people in those pictures had ever considered what happened to the staff members who made their institutions function every day. The nurses who stayed late, the technicians who kept equipment running, the housekeeping staff who cleaned rooms after tragedy, the receptionists who absorbed anger from frightened families, the people whose names never appeared on plaques. Vivian sat near the opposite end of the table with her attorney. She looked composed, but her confidence was different now. The sharp certainty from the hallway was gone. She had read the investigation summary. She knew the footage existed. She knew the witnesses had spoken. She knew that the hospital no longer needed to choose between protecting its employees and protecting a donor, because the donor had become the very thing the hospital needed protection from. Graham sat several seats away. He looked smaller than Daniela remembered. Not physically, but in presence. The man who had once controlled the hallway with a few cold instructions now kept his hands folded in front of him, as though he could make himself less visible by becoming still. The board chair began by summarizing the findings. She spoke in careful, formal language. She described the documented assault. She described the improper suspension of Daniela without investigation. She described the failure to follow workplace violence procedures. She described the evidence that donor influence had affected staffing and patient access decisions. Then she spoke about institutional responsibility. That was the moment the room changed. Because until then, the case could have been treated as a conflict between Vivian and Daniela. But the board chair made it clear that it was not. The failure belonged to the system. Vivian had committed the assault. Graham had enabled the cover-up. But the hospital had created the conditions in which both believed they could act without consequences. The chair then invited Daniela to speak. Daniela stood slowly. She had prepared notes, But when she looked around the room, she realized she did not want to read them. She did not want her words to sound rehearsed. She wanted the people who had spent 2 days discussing liability and reputation to understand what the event had felt like from the inside. She explained that she had worked at St. Alden for 8 years because she believed in the hospital's mission. She had cared for patients who could not pay, patients who had no family, patients who arrived angry because fear had made them feel helpless. She had never expected every day to be easy. She understood that hospitals were stressful places, but she said there was a difference between stress and injustice. She said the slap hurt, but it was not the part she would remember most. What she would remember was looking around afterward and seeing people who knew the truth choose silence because they believed the truth would not protect them. She said that no employee should have to wonder whether their safety depends on the social status of the person hurting them. She said that no patient should have to wait longer because someone wealthy believes their comfort matters more than another person's survival. And she said that no hospital should call itself a place of healing while allowing fear to become part of its culture. Daniela did not ask for revenge. She asked for change. She asked for a policy that protected employees from violence, regardless of who caused it. She asked for a clear process that prevented donors, executives, or board members from interfering with clinical triage. She asked for a confidential reporting system so witnesses could speak without fearing retaliation. And she asked for training that would teach staff what to do when they saw harm happening in front of them. When she finished, no one applauded. It was not that kind of room. But the silence this time was different. It was not fear. It was shame. Vivian's attorney spoke next. He attempted to frame the assault as an isolated lapse in judgment. He emphasized Vivian's years of charitable work, her contributions to the city, and the stress of the moment. He suggested that she had become overwhelmed after being told her procedure was delayed. But the argument sounded weak against the evidence. Stress did not explain entering a restricted corridor. Stress did not explain taking Daniela's badge. Stress did not explain inventing a false story. And stress certainly did not explain why Vivian expected the hospital to punish the woman she had struck. When Vivian finally spoke, she did not offer a full apology. Not yet. She said she regretted that the situation had escalated. She said she never intended for Daniela to be harmed. She said she had felt ignored and disrespected. But even in that moment, she still spoke as though the greatest injury had happened to her. Daniela watched quietly. She understood something Vivian did not. An apology that begins with self-pity is not an apology. It is another attempt to avoid accountability. The board adjourned for private deliberation. The decision took several hours. During that time, Samuel remained outside the process. Horizon's legal team had advised him not to participate in any decision involving Daniela directly, and he respected that boundary. But he sat with her in a quiet waiting area near the executive offices, not speaking much, not trying to solve anything, simply making sure she did not have to face the day alone. At one point, Daniela asked him whether he thought the board would actually do the right thing. Samuel did not answer with certainty. He had worked in healthcare long enough to know that institutions often changed slowly, even when the truth was obvious. He knew that board members worried about lawsuits, public image, donor relationships, and financial stability. He knew that people sometimes chose the least painful option instead of the right one. But he told her something else. Whatever the board decided, the truth had already changed the hospital. The hallway was no longer silent. The witnesses had spoken. The footage existed. The emails existed. And once people had seen how fear had shaped their choices, they could not pretend they had not seen it. Late that afternoon, the board called everyone back into the conference room. The chair read the decisions one by one. Vivian Hollis was immediately banned from all non-emergency access to St. Alden Regional Hospital. She would no longer be permitted to visit the hospital as a donor, guest, or member of any advisory group. Her foundation's naming rights agreement for the pediatric expansion was terminated. The board also voted to return all unused funds tied to the naming arrangement rather than allow the hospital's future to remain connected to her influence. For Vivian, it was a blow unlike anything she had experienced. Her name had always opened doors. Now it was being removed from one. The board also confirmed that the hospital would cooperate fully with law enforcement regarding the assault. The security footage and witness statements were turned over to the district attorney's office. Vivian's wealth could hire attorneys. It could delay some things. It could soften some public embarrassment. But it could not make the video disappear. Graham Mercer was suspended immediately pending termination proceedings. The board cited his failure to protect an employee, his improper handling of the incident, his retaliation against Daniela, and his repeated use of donor influence to interfere with hospital operations. A separate audit would review every case in which special treatment had been given to high-profile donors or board-connected individuals. For Graham, the punishment was more painful than losing a title. He had built his career around being indispensable. He had convinced himself that he was protecting the hospital by keeping powerful people happy. He had told himself that compromises were necessary, that everyone benefited from the money, that someone had to manage difficult personalities. But now the truth was impossible to avoid. He had not protected the hospital. He had weakened it. He had taught staff that policy could be bought. He had taught donors that influence came before ethics. And he had helped create the exact environment that allowed Vivian Hollis to believe she could strike a nurse and walk away untouched. Daniela was formally reinstated with full back pay for the time she had been placed on leave. The board issued a written apology, acknowledging that the hospital had failed to protect her. It also committed to establishing a new Employee Safety and Witness Protection Council, led jointly by frontline staff and independent compliance officers. Daniela was asked to help design the program. At first, she hesitated. She did not want a title given to her as a gesture. She did not want to become a symbol used in a press release and forgotten once the headlines faded. She wanted assurance that the council would have real authority, real reporting channels, and real protection for employees who spoke up. The board agreed. Lillian Park would serve beside her. Dr. Megan Blake volunteered to help create mandatory training for physicians and staff on bystander intervention, workplace violence, and ethical escalation. The program would teach people how to document incidents, how to intervene safely, and how to report retaliation without losing their jobs. For Megan, it was not enough to say she was sorry. She wanted to make sure the next person in her position would know what courage looked like before it was too late. Helen Ward received a letter from the board thanking her for her statement. She laughed when her daughter read it aloud, saying that she had only said what anyone should say when they see someone being treated badly. But that was exactly why her statement mattered. Helen had no title, no influence, no professional obligation. She had simply chosen not to look away. The criminal case against Vivian moved more slowly than the hospital investigation. Legal processes often did. Months passed. News outlets reported on the suspension of Graham Mercer and the termination of the Hollis naming agreement. Public reaction was divided at first. Some people praised the hospital for acting. Others argued that Vivian's years of charity should not be erased by one terrible moment. But the security footage changed the conversation. Once people saw what had happened, it became difficult to describe it as a misunderstanding. Vivian eventually accepted a plea agreement on a misdemeanor assault charge. She was ordered to complete community service at a non-profit medical clinic, attend a behavioral accountability program, and remain away from Daniela. The court also required her to make a financial contribution to an independent employee safety fund, though Daniela made it clear that she did not want the money treated as forgiveness. No amount could undo what happened, but it could help protect someone else. Vivian's community service was not glamorous. The nonprofit clinic served people who had no insurance, people who worked multiple jobs, people who delayed care because they could not afford it, and people who had spent years being treated as invisible by systems that were supposed to help them. For the first time in her life, Vivian had to stand in a place where no one cared about her family name. She was not introduced as a donor. She was not given special access. She was asked to organize supplies, prepare waiting areas, help with basic administrative tasks, and listen when patients needed directions. At first, she resented it. She moved through the clinic with the stiff posture of someone who believed she had been unfairly reduced. But week after week, she saw people waiting patiently for care they could not afford. She saw exhausted mothers trying to keep children calm. She saw elderly patients apologizing for asking too many questions. She saw nurses working through lunch because there were too many people to help. And slowly, painfully, she began to understand something she had never understood before. Being treated with dignity was not a privilege. It was the minimum every person deserved. Whether Vivian truly changed was something no one could know immediately. Real change was not proven by one apology, one court order, or one act of public humility. It was proven over time, through choices made when no cameras were watching and no consequences were guaranteed. But one thing was certain: she would never again walk into St. Aldan Regional believing the building belonged to her. As for Graham Mercer, the investigation continued long after he left the hospital. The audit uncovered several other cases in which employees had been pressured to accommodate donors in ways that compromised policy. Some incidents were small, others were more serious. In every case, the pattern was the same. Graham had treated the hospital's ethical boundaries as flexible whenever money was involved. He lost his position, his influence, and the trust he had spent years pretending to earn. No one sent him out through a back exit. No one needed to. His choices had already made every door close. Months later, St. Aldan Regional Hospital began to change in visible ways. New signs appeared near staff entrances and waiting areas, clearly stating that violence against healthcare workers would not be tolerated, regardless of a visitor's status, connections, or financial contributions. A confidential reporting line was created. Security procedures were strengthened. Donor relations were separated from clinical decision-making. No executive could move a staff member or interfere with triage without written documentation and independent review. The changes did not erase the past, but they made it harder for the past to repeat itself. Daniela returned to work gradually. Her first day back on the 3rd floor was harder than she expected. She had told herself that she was ready, but when she stepped into the same corridor where Vivian had slapped her, her body remembered before her mind did. The polished floor, the restricted access sign, the sound of carts rolling in the distance, everything brought the moment back. For a few seconds, she stood still. Then Lillian appeared beside her. She did not say anything dramatic. She simply stood there, close enough to remind Daniela that she was no longer alone. Soon after, Megan joined them. She looked nervous but determined. She had spent the past few weeks helping develop the first staff workshop on intervention and reporting. She told Daniela that the session had filled faster than expected. Nurses, doctors, technicians, and support staff had all signed up. People wanted to learn. People wanted to do better. Daniela looked down the hallway. The same place that had once witnessed silence was now becoming part of a different story. Not a perfect story. Not one where everyone suddenly became brave, but one where fear was no longer allowed to be the final answer. Over time, Daniela became known for more than what had happened to her. She became one of the strongest voices in the new Employee Safety Council. She listened to staff members who had been afraid to report harassment. She helped younger nurses understand that professionalism did not mean accepting abuse. She worked with administrators to make sure policies were not just words on paper. And every time someone told her they were afraid to speak up, she remembered the hallway. She remembered the badge being pulled from her uniform. She remembered the sting of Vivian's hand. But more than anything, she remembered the silence. Because silence had been the true enemy. Not only Vivian's arrogance, not only Graham's corruption, not even the hospital's fear of losing money. The real danger had been the moment when decent people saw wrong happening and convinced themselves that it was safer not to get involved. Daniela understood that courage did not always look dramatic. It did not always arrive with power, influence, or a perfect speech. Sometimes it looked like an older patient giving an honest statement. Sometimes it looked like a doctor admitting that she had been afraid. Sometimes it looked like a nurse forwarding an email she had kept hidden for months. And sometimes it looked like a person refusing to let humiliation turn them into silence. One afternoon, nearly a year after the incident, Daniela stood near the emergency department entrance as another busy shift began. The hospital was crowded again. Ambulances arrived. Families waited. Nurses moved quickly between rooms. The work had not become easier. Hospitals were still complicated places. People were still tired. Mistakes still happened. But something fundamental had changed. A young nurse approached Daniela after dealing with an angry visitor who had shouted at her near the waiting room. The nurse looked shaken. In the past, she might have apologized for causing trouble. She might have tried to handle it alone. Instead, she reported it. Security responded. A supervisor documented the incident. Other staff members stood beside her. It was a small moment. Most people would never hear about it. But Daniela watched the young nurse walk away, knowing she had been protected. And she felt something settle inside her. That was what justice looked like after the headlines faded. Not only punishment, not only public shame, but a world made safer because someone refused to accept what used to be normal. The day Vivian Hollis slapped Daniela Cruz, she believed she was punishing a nurse for forgetting her place. What she did not understand was that Daniela had never forgotten her place. Daniela's place was beside patients who needed care, beside co-workers who needed protection, beside the truth, even when the truth was inconvenient. And in the end, the woman who thought the hospital belonged to her learned the lesson she had spent a lifetime avoiding. Money can buy attention. It can buy access. It can even buy silence for a while. But it cannot buy the right to take another person's dignity. And when enough people finally choose to speak, even the most powerful lie begins to fall apart. If you believe no one should have to stand alone against injustice, share your thoughts in the comments. And remember this: sometimes the bravest thing a person can do is not look away.
Step away from that Ferrari before I make this worse for you.
Malcolm Reed did not move an inch.
You already made it worse when you decided I could not own it.
His appearance told Vanessa everything she assumed.
A man like you does not arrive here in a car like that.
But Malcolm gave her one quiet warning.
Be very careful with the story you are about to tell.
Vanessa turned suspicion into a public accusation.
Someone call security! This man is trying to steal from my company!
The valet knew the truth was nearby.
Ma'am, I think you should look at the registration first.
Vanessa made sure he could not speak.
One more word, and you will lose this job tonight.
Malcolm protected him without raising his voice.
Do not punish him for telling the truth.
The truth is obvious. He does not belong beside a Ferrari.
The crowd watched Vanessa judge him openly. Still, Malcolm never looked afraid. Then police lights washed over the Ferrari.
Sir, keep your hands where I can see them. Before you touch me, you may want to call your superiors.
But Malcolm's silence had a history. To understand why Malcolm Reed stood there so still while a woman tried to turn his life into a crime scene, you have to understand that he had survived far worse than being underestimated. He had built his entire life in rooms where people looked at him last, listened to him least, and then acted surprised when his ideas saved them. Malcolm had been born in a neighborhood where broken engines were more common than working streetlights, and where boys learned early that the world often noticed their mistakes faster than their talent. His father had driven buses for nearly 30 years. His mother cleaned offices and buildings where the executives never learned her name. But in their small garage behind the house, Malcolm found a language that did not care about status. Engines either worked or they did not. Metal either fit or it failed. A machine could be understood if a person had patience, discipline, and the humility to listen. As a child, Malcolm could not afford model cars, so he drew them. He sketched the curves of Italian sports cars from old magazines other people threw away. He studied the way light moved across the hood of a Ferrari, the way every line seemed to be a decision made by someone who understood speed as both science and poetry. But he did not love cars because they were expensive. He loved them because they were proof that imagination could become something real enough to touch. While other boys dreamed of owning a Ferrari, Malcolm dreamed of understanding why one existed at all. He wanted to know how beauty and engineering could meet in one object so perfectly that even a stranger on the sidewalk would stop breathing for half a second. That obsession carried him out of the neighborhood, through scholarships, late-night jobs, and years of being the only person in the room who looked like him. He became an engineer first, then a designer, then a businessman almost by accident. People who understood cars trusted him. People who understood numbers eventually had no choice but to respect him. But Malcolm never chased attention. Attention to him was a noisy room where people applauded before they understood the cost of what they were praising. He preferred quiet ownership. He preferred to build things and let others stand beneath the lights. It was a habit born partly from humility and partly from pain. The person who understood that pain best was his wife, Eleanor Reed. Eleanor had met Malcolm before anyone called him brilliant, before investors returned his calls, before his first company appeared in financial magazines. She had met him when he still carried engine grease under his fingernails and apology in his posture, as though the world had taught him to take up less space than he deserved. Eleanor never saw him that way. She saw the mind behind the quiet. She saw the patience behind the restraint. She saw a man who could walk past a showroom window and describe, from memory, how the car inside breathed. For years, Malcolm and Eleanor built a life that looked ordinary from the outside and extraordinary from within. She taught high school literature. He worked impossible hours in the automotive industry, first repairing what others broke, then designing systems that made luxury dealerships more efficient, more honest, and more profitable. He believed the car business did not have to be built on arrogance. He believed that people buying a dream should not be cheated by those selling it. Eleanor believed in him so completely that when he hesitated to start his own company, she placed a notebook on the kitchen table and filled the first page with the name she thought belonged to his future. Reed Caldwell Automotive Group. Caldwell was not Malcolm's name. It belonged to Richard Caldwell, a charming investor with old money, perfect teeth, and the kind of confidence that opened doors before he knocked. Richard had the connections Malcolm lacked. Malcolm had the vision Richard could never have invented. Together, they launched what would eventually become Caldwell Prestige Motors, a chain of high-end dealerships known for rare European cars, white glove service, and a reputation so polished that wealthy customers trusted it before reading the contracts. In the early days, Malcolm believed partnership meant shared purpose. He learned later that some people use partnership as a polite word for taking what another person built. Richard Caldwell liked Malcolm's mind, but he did not like Malcolm's presence at the front of the company. Investors, Richard warned, were more comfortable with a familiar face. Clients, he suggested, expected a certain image. Malcolm heard the meaning beneath every careful phrase. He had heard it his whole life. So he stayed behind the curtain and built the systems, trained the staff, negotiated the supplier relationships, and designed the customer ethics policy that became the company's hidden strength. Richard smiled at ribbon cuttings. Malcolm made sure the lights stayed on. Then came the betrayal. It was not dramatic at first. Betrayal rarely announces itself with thunder. It arrives as missing paperwork, delayed signatures, board meetings rescheduled without notice, legal language no one explains until it is too late. By the time Malcolm realized Richard had tried to push him out, the company was already wearing another man's name like a stolen suit. Eleanor wanted him to fight publicly. She wanted the world to know who had built the foundation beneath Caldwell's marble floors. Malcolm wanted justice too, but he also knew the cost of a public battle. He had seen what powerful men could do when they felt exposed. He chose a slower kind of justice, one that required patience, discipline, and the kind of silence most people mistake for surrender. With Eleanor's help, Malcolm protected what mattered. Through a private family trust, carefully structured before Richard understood what was happening, Malcolm retained controlling interest in the holding company behind Caldwell Prestige Motors. Richard kept the spotlight. Malcolm kept the keys. The arrangement was strange, but it worked. Malcolm stepped away from the public face of the company and built a private investment firm that quietly rescued businesses, funded scholarships, and supported young mechanics who reminded him of the boy he used to be. Richard Caldwell enjoyed fame until illness and debt consumed the last years of his life. After his death, the Caldwell name remained, but the real power never sat where outsiders thought it did. Eleanor was the only person who knew how much that silence had cost him. She knew that every time Malcolm entered one of his own dealerships and watched employees fail to recognize him, a small part of him had to choose peace over pride. She also knew he was not weak. He was waiting. Not waiting for revenge exactly, but for the right moment to turn ownership into protection. She used to tell him that wealth was only meaningful when it defended people who had none. Malcolm carried those words long after Eleanor became ill, long after hospital rooms replaced business meetings, long after the woman who had believed in him before the world did left him with more money than he wanted, and one promise he could not forget. The Ferrari came from that promise. Years before Eleanor died, she and Malcolm had walked past a private collection after a charity dinner. Inside, under warm museum lights, was a deep red Ferrari, 812 Superfast, elegant and aggressive, a machine that seemed to be moving even while parked. Eleanor had smiled at the way Malcolm stopped talking mid-sentence. She had known he was not seeing status. He was seeing childhood, survival, and design brought together in one impossible shape. She had told him that one day, when he finally stopped hiding from the life he had earned, he should buy one in red, not because rich men did, but because the boy in the garage deserved to see his dream in color. Malcolm did not buy it while she was alive. During her illness, extravagance felt obscene. After her funeral, it felt empty. But on the first anniversary of her passing, he purchased the Ferrari through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust, not as a trophy, but as a memorial. He had her initials engraved inside the cabin, where only someone looking closely would notice. He drove it rarely, and only on days connected to purpose. The car was not a toy. It was a reminder that grief could travel with beauty, and that promises made in love did not expire when a heartbeat stopped. The night of the Meridian Auto Museum Gala was one of those days. Caldwell Prestige Motors was sponsoring the event, at least publicly, but the real money came from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The gala was meant to launch a scholarship program for underprivileged students entering automotive engineering and technical training. Malcolm had insisted the program focus not on polished applicants with perfect resumes, but on young people who had learned from broken engines, family sacrifice, and necessity. He wanted the scholarship to find the version of himself the world had nearly missed. Vanessa Caldwell had other priorities. She was not Richard Caldwell's daughter, though she allowed people to assume the connection when it helped her. She had married briefly into the extended Caldwell family, kept the name after the divorce, and built a career out of appearing indispensable to men who confused Polish with competence. Vanessa had been appointed interim CEO after a leadership scandal shook the company, and she treated the temporary position as though it were a throne. She understood luxury branding, media optics, and the social choreography of wealthy rooms. She did not understand loyalty. She did not understand craftsmanship. And she certainly did not understand the kind of quiet power that did not need to introduce itself. To Vanessa, Caldwell Prestige Motors was an image to be sold. She wanted to merge the company with a foreign luxury conglomerate that had no interest in Malcolm's ethics policies, scholarship commitments, or employee protections. The sale would have given Vanessa an enormous personal bonus and a permanent title in the new organization. It also would have gutted the foundation Malcolm had built. Customer service departments would be outsourced. Longtime mechanics would be dismissed. The scholarship fund would be renamed, reduced, and folded into a marketing campaign. Vanessa called it modernization. Malcolm saw it for what it was: extraction disguised as progress. For months, Malcolm had watched from a distance as reports crossed his desk. Customer complaints rose. Employees resigned. Warranty claims were delayed to improve quarterly numbers. A small transfer from the charity budget had been labeled as event preparation, then moved again through consulting fees. No single entry proved corruption by itself, but together they created a pattern. Malcolm had seen enough patterns in his life to know when a machine was beginning to fail. He did not rush. He asked his legal team to gather documents. He asked the board chair to observe quietly. And then he accepted the invitation to attend the Meridian Gala in person. He did not tell Vanessa he was coming. He did not ask for a reserved entrance. He did not request a security escort or a press announcement. He drove himself in the Ferrari because Eleanor would have laughed at the idea of him arriving in a chauffeured sedan to a scholarship created in her name. He wore a simple navy jacket, a white shirt, and the watch Eleanor had given him when their first company turned a profit. The watch was not flashy. Its value was sentimental, not obvious. That was how Malcolm preferred most things. At the museum, the evening was already glittering when he arrived. The building curved in glass and steel around a central hall filled with historic race cars, polished engines, and photographs of drivers who had risked everything for speed. Wealth moved through the room with practiced ease. Champagne glasses caught the light. Sponsors smiled for cameras. Young scholarship applicants stood near the edges, dressed in borrowed suits and careful dresses, trying not to look overwhelmed by a world that had rarely opened doors for them. Malcolm noticed them first. He always noticed the people standing at the edges. One of those young people was Jordan Ellis, a valet assigned to the front entrance for the evening. Jordan was 22, nervous, and trying hard to appear invisible. 3 years earlier, he had been one bad month away from dropping out of a technical training program when an anonymous grant paid his tuition balance. He never learned the donor's name, only that the grant came from a trust connected to automotive education. What Jordan did not know yet was that the man stepping out of the red Ferrari was the reason he had a uniform, a job, and a future still within reach. Jordan recognized the car before he recognized the man. Everyone did. The Ferrari seemed to gather attention as naturally as fire gathers heat. Malcolm handed over no performance, no boast, no demand for special treatment. He simply greeted Jordan with respect, asked whether the staff had been given a place to eat during the long event, and waited for the answer with the seriousness of someone who considered that question important. Jordan was so startled by the courtesy that it took him a moment to respond. Most guests treated valet workers as extensions of the curb. Malcolm treated him as a person whose comfort mattered. That small exchange might have passed unnoticed if Vanessa Caldwell had not been standing near the entrance, preparing for a photographer. She saw the Ferrari first, then Malcolm, then Jordan's uncertain expression. In the space of a few seconds, her mind arranged those details into the only story her prejudice could accept. The car was too rare. The man was too understated. The valet looked too nervous, and the gala was too important for her to risk embarrassment. Vanessa did not approach like a host welcoming a donor. She approached like a property owner finding a stranger near the silverware. Malcolm saw the change in her face before she spoke. He had seen it in boutiques, hotels, boardrooms, country clubs, and once in the lobby of a bank that held more of his money than the manager earned in a decade. It was the look of someone deciding that evidence was unnecessary because assumption felt more natural. Vanessa asked for proof before she asked for his name. She looked at his jacket, then at the Ferrari, then at the gathering crowd, as though she were protecting civilization from a clerical error. Malcolm could have ended the moment there. He could have given his full name, called the board chair, or let one of the wealthiest families in the city learn within seconds who he was. But he had not come to the gala to perform power. He had come to watch what Caldwell had become when it believed he was absent. So he did what he had done for most of his life. He stayed calm, offered the simplest truth, and watched carefully to see who would choose fairness when fairness was inconvenient. Vanessa failed that test almost immediately. Vanessa Caldwell had spent her career learning how to turn uncertainty into authority. She knew that in wealthy spaces, the person who sounded most offended often controlled the room. So when Malcolm Reed calmly explained that the Ferrari belonged to him, she treated his calmness not as evidence of innocence, but as arrogance. She insisted that the vehicle matched one recently serviced by Caldwell Prestige Motors, and because her company had sponsored the gala, she claimed a responsibility to protect its assets, its reputation, and its guests. The words sounded professional enough from a distance. Up close, they were something uglier, wearing a tailored suit. Malcolm listened without interruption. That made people uneasy. A guilty man, they expected, would panic. An innocent man, they assumed, would defend himself loudly. Malcolm did neither. He stood beside the Ferrari with the stillness of someone who had learned long ago that raising his voice would only make certain people feel justified in fearing him. He removed the registration card from a leather folder and offered it to Vanessa. She glanced at it only long enough to dismiss it. The name on the paperwork did not satisfy her because it did not match the story she had already chosen. Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust meant nothing to her except another obstacle between her accusation and the public victory she wanted. The crowd grew thicker. Guests who had come to celebrate charity now lingered for scandal. A few recorded openly. Others pretended to check messages while angling their phones toward Malcolm's face. This was how humiliation multiplied in the modern world. It no longer needed a courtroom or a newspaper. It needed only a confident liar, a silent crowd, and a camera hungry enough to turn a human being into content before the truth had time to breathe. Jordan Ellis stood near the valet podium with his hands tight at his sides. He knew something was wrong. The man beside the Ferrari did not move like a thief. He had arrived openly, not in a rush. He had spoken kindly. He had known to ask about the staff meal, a detail no ordinary guest noticed. Most importantly, Jordan had seen the registration card. He had caught the name of the trust, and something about it stirred a memory from the tuition letter he had kept folded in a shoebox at home. The grant that saved his future had come from the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The same words were on the card Vanessa had just refused to believe. Jordan wanted to speak, but fear trapped him. His supervisor had warned the valet staff before the event that Vanessa Caldwell did not tolerate embarrassment. Workers who caused trouble would not be invited back. For Jordan, losing this job meant more than missing a paycheck. It meant falling behind on rent, delaying certification, maybe returning to the same dead-end work he had fought to escape. He watched Vanessa sharpen her accusation, and shame burned in him because he understood how silence could become cooperation. Inside the museum, the gala continued without understanding that its true purpose was being threatened outside the doors. Young students stood near displays of vintage engines, while donors congratulated themselves for generosity. A large banner promised a new future for overlooked talent in automotive engineering. Malcolm had funded that banner. He had funded the scholarships, the mentorship program, and the equipment grants that would follow. Yet outside, the man whose money made the evening possible was being treated as the danger. Vanessa's suspicion quickly became performance. She reminded everyone within earshot that Caldwell Prestige Motors dealt in vehicles worth more than most homes, and could not afford to ignore irregularities. She emphasized that the Ferrari was a rare model, that criminals often targeted events like this, and that responsible leadership required swift action. Every sentence made her sound less like a woman seeking truth and more like someone auditioning for applause. The fact that Malcolm remained composed only irritated her further. She needed him to look guilty. She needed fear in his eyes. She needed the crowd to see what she believed she saw. When museum security arrived, Vanessa did not present uncertainty. She presented conclusion. She described Malcolm as an unauthorized individual attempting to take control of a high-value vehicle connected to her company. The words were careful, polished, and poisonous. They avoided the crudeness of open prejudice while carrying the same conclusion. This man didn't belong here, and therefore his ownership must be impossible. Malcolm again offered documentation. Again, Vanessa's certainty moved faster than anyone's willingness to verify. Security asked Malcolm to step away from the vehicle. He did. That small act of cooperation seemed to disappoint the people waiting for drama. He did not reach into his pocket suddenly. He did not challenge them with anger. He simply stepped back, folded his hands, and asked that the documents be checked before anyone treated an assumption as fact. One guard looked embarrassed. Another looked toward Vanessa, as though her title mattered more than the paperwork in Malcolm's hand. That glance told Malcolm almost everything he needed to know about the culture she had created. Vanessa noticed it too. Power teaches some people to recognize hesitation and punish it before it becomes courage. She pressed harder, reminding the guards that the entire gala was under media coverage and that any delay could become a reputational disaster. What she did not mention was that she had already created the disaster. In her mind, reputation meant controlling how things looked, not whether they were right. The first police car arrived 10 minutes later. To the crowd, it felt like confirmation. People who had been unsure now adjusted their faces into expressions of concern. Police lights have a way of turning suspicion into a script, and once that script begins, many people stop asking who wrote it. Malcolm watched the officers approach. He had known this possibility from the moment Vanessa raised her voice. He had also known that his wealth, his documents, and his education might not protect him quickly enough if the wrong person decided that his calmness was defiance. The lead officer, Daniel Price, was not cruel in the theatrical way Vanessa was cruel. His danger was quieter. He arrived with the fatigue of a man who believed he had seen enough to trust shortcuts. Vanessa gave him her version first. She did it quickly, confidently, and with just enough corporate language to sound credible. She described the Ferrari as possibly stolen from company custody, Malcolm as evasive, and the registration paperwork as suspicious. By the time Malcolm was invited to explain, he was no longer a man beside his own car. He was a suspect, attempting to overcome a story already planted. Malcolm handed over his identification and the registration card. Officer Price studied them, then studied Malcolm, then looked at Vanessa. That sequence mattered. The documents should have been the center of gravity. Instead, the officer's eyes kept returning to the woman in the expensive dress, who seemed so certain. Malcolm recognized the old imbalance. Paper was supposed to speak equally for everyone, but in the real world, paper often needed a powerful person to read it honestly. Vanessa grew bolder when she sensed the officer's uncertainty. She claimed there had been internal alerts about inventory irregularities at a Caldwell service facility. That part was not entirely false, which made the lie more dangerous. There had been irregularities, but they were not caused by Malcolm. They were caused by Vanessa's own pressure on employees to move vehicles and records in ways that made quarterly reports look cleaner than they were. One of those records involved a Ferrari recently serviced under a trust account. Vanessa had seen the paperwork days earlier and ignored the owner's name because she was focused on something else, hiding the fact that charity funds and service charges had been shifted between accounts before the merger review. The Ferrari, in other words, was not evidence of Malcolm's crime. It was evidence of Vanessa's panic. But no one outside the museum knew that yet. All they saw was a black man being questioned beside a car they assumed belonged to someone richer, louder, and more expected. Officer Price asked Malcolm why he had come to the event. Malcolm explained that he had been invited. Vanessa challenged that immediately, claiming she had personally reviewed the VIP list and did not recall seeing his name. She made memory sound like proof. Malcolm did not argue. He simply provided the digital invitation stored on his phone. Vanessa leaned in, saw the donor access credential, and for the first time a flicker of concern crossed her face. It disappeared quickly, but Malcolm saw it. The credential did not list him as Malcolm Reed. It listed him under the name of the trust. That was by his own design. For years, he had preferred the work to be recognized, not the man behind it. But now the privacy that had protected his peace gave Vanessa room to attack him. She suggested the invitation could have been obtained improperly. She suggested the trust name could be used as cover. She suggested anything that kept her from admitting the simplest possibility, that she had been wrong from the beginning. A younger officer asked whether someone from Caldwell's headquarters could verify the service records. Vanessa answered before Malcolm could. She insisted that she was the highest-ranking Caldwell executive present, and that her judgment should be sufficient until the vehicle could be impounded. The word impounded moved through the crowd like a spark. Phones lifted higher. Jordan's face tightened. Malcolm looked toward the Ferrari, not because he feared losing it, but because the thought of that car being dragged away under suspicion felt like an insult to Eleanor's memory. He remembered the day the Ferrari arrived. He had stood alone in the delivery room, while the dealer representative explained features Malcolm already understood better than he did. The car had gleamed beneath the lights, but Malcolm had not touched the steering wheel right away. He had placed his hand on the seat beside him, imagining Eleanor there, teasing him for pretending not to be emotional. He had whispered nothing aloud. He had only breathed through grief and gratitude until both became too large to separate. Now Vanessa was turning that memory into evidence of theft, and the cruelty of it settled deeper than her words. Still, Malcolm remained calm. Not because he felt nothing, but because he felt too much to waste it on spectacle. He asked Officer Price to contact the registration authority, the insurer, and the attorney listed on the trust documents. He also asked that the vehicle not be touched until its ownership was verified. The requests were reasonable. Vanessa treated them as manipulation. She accused him of trying to delay accountability and warned the officers that sophisticated thieves often used paperwork to confuse law enforcement. That phrase pleased her. It made prejudice sound like expertise. The situation might have turned then if Jordan had found his courage sooner. He stepped forward halfway, then stopped when Vanessa's assistant, a thin man named Miles Voss, moved beside him and quietly reminded him that temporary staff were replaceable. Miles did not need to raise his voice. Fear does not require volume when the power imbalance is clear. Jordan swallowed what he knew and stepped back. Malcolm saw the exchange. He did not blame the young man. He had once been young enough to know how expensive courage could be. Inside the museum, the gala program was nearing the scholarship announcement. Vanessa was supposed to appear on stage in 15 minutes. She knew that if Malcolm was still outside, if police were still questioning him, if guests kept filming, the evening would become impossible to control. So she made the choice that revealed her more clearly than anything she had said. She urged the officers to remove him from the entrance before donors became uncomfortable. Not before the truth was verified. Not before paperwork was checked. Before donors became uncomfortable. That was the moment Malcolm understood that Vanessa had to be removed from Caldwell, not merely corrected. A person who valued donor comfort over human dignity could not be trusted with a scholarship fund built for overlooked students. A leader who saw humiliation as a branding problem could not protect employees who lacked power. Malcolm had come to observe. Vanessa had given him the answer. Officer Price asked Malcolm to place his hands where they could be seen while they sorted things out. The request was framed as procedure, but procedure can feel very different, depending on whose body carries the risk. The crowd grew silent in the way crowds do when they know something wrong is happening, but want permission from authority before admitting it. Malcolm complied. He could feel dozens of eyes on him. He could feel Eleanor's initials inside the car behind him. He could feel old memories rising. The bank lobby, the hotel elevator, the showroom where a salesman once assumed he was the driver for someone else. Each memory carried the same message. Prove you belong. Prove you are not a threat. Prove you own what you built. Then Jordan finally moved. He did not shout. He did not make a grand speech. He stepped toward Officer Price with his hands trembling and explained that he had seen the registration card, that the trust name matched the scholarship donor materials, and that Malcolm had arrived as an invited guest. His voice shook, but truth does not need to be fearless to matter. Vanessa turned on him instantly. She accused him of interfering in a police matter and warned that his employment would be reviewed. The threat landed exactly where she aimed it. Jordan went pale, but he did not step back this time. That small act changed the air. One of the younger scholarship applicants inside the museum noticed the commotion through the glass. Then another. Soon, several students moved toward the entrance, drawn not by gossip, but by the uneasy recognition that the man outside looked more like their fathers, uncles, neighbors, and future selves than anyone on the gala stage. They had come to be celebrated by a company claiming to believe in overlooked talent. Now they were watching that company's acting CEO overlook truth in real time. Malcolm looked at Jordan with gratitude, but not surprise. Courage often begins as a whisper. He knew that. He also knew Vanessa would punish the young man if she survived the night with power intact. So Malcolm made one final request, this time not to the officer, but to the process itself. He asked that his attorney be contacted immediately and that the board chair of Caldwell Prestige Motors be informed that the trust's representative was being detained at the entrance of the event, funded by that same trust. Vanessa laughed at the phrase trust's representative, not loudly, but with enough contempt for those closest to hear. She thought Malcolm was dressing himself in legal language to escape consequence. She did not understand that he had just given her one last chance to pause before stepping over the edge. Officer Price, still unsure but increasingly aware that the situation was more complicated than Vanessa had claimed, allowed Malcolm to make a call. Malcolm did not call a friend to rescue him emotionally. He called Amina Pierce, the attorney who had protected his interests for 15 years and who had warned him that Vanessa Caldwell's ambition had finally become dangerous. He gave her only a few calm details: the museum entrance, the Ferrari, the attempted impound, the presence of police, and Vanessa's refusal to verify ownership. Amina did not need more. She had been waiting for the machine to expose its broken part. While they waited, Vanessa tried to reclaim control by moving the event forward. She instructed Miles to inform the stage manager that the scholarship announcement would be delayed due to a security issue. That phrase spread quickly through staff radios. Security issue. It sounded clean. It sounded neutral. It erased Malcolm's name, Vanessa's accusation, Jordan's courage, and the simple fact that the only danger present had been created by a woman who mistook her bias for leadership. Minutes passed. The crowd shifted. The police checked the license plate and found no stolen vehicle report. They checked Malcolm's identification and found no warrant, no record, no reason to restrain him. But Vanessa kept insisting that internal company records raised concern. She promised documentation from Caldwell's system, and Miles hurried to retrieve a tablet. When he returned, the record he showed listed the Ferrari as pending corporate hold. It looked official enough to confuse the officers. It was also false, altered that afternoon by someone using executive access. Malcolm saw the screen and understood. The accusation was no longer just prejudice. It was fraud being improvised in public. For the first time that evening, his expression changed. Not into anger, not exactly, but into something colder. Disappointment, sharpened by certainty. Vanessa mistook it for fear and pressed forward, urging the officers to detain him until the discrepancy could be resolved. Officer Price reached for his cuffs, not with eagerness, but with the weary surrender of a man letting a flawed process carry him. Jordan stepped forward again, but a security guard blocked him. Several guests began recording closer. Vanessa's eyes brightened with victory. And in that suspended moment, as Malcolm Reed stood beside the Ferrari that carried his wife's initials, with one officer preparing to turn assumption into restraint, the glass doors of the museum opened behind the crowd. A woman in a gray suit entered with a leather case in one hand and the expression of someone who had not come to negotiate. Behind her walked Bernard Hayes, the board chair Vanessa had been trying to avoid for months, and Marisol Chen, Caldwell's chief financial officer, carrying a folder thick enough to end careers. Vanessa saw them and went still. Malcolm did not smile. He simply lowered his hands and waited for the truth to arrive. Amina Pierce did not need to raise her voice to take control of the entrance. Some people carry authority like jewelry, bright and decorative, meant to be noticed before it is useful. Amina carried it like a blade kept sharp in silence. She moved through the crowd without asking anyone to step aside, and still they did. Bernard Hayes followed with the exhausted look of a man who had ignored too many warning signs and was now watching them gather into proof. Marisol Chen kept her eyes on Vanessa, not with hatred, but with the clean sadness of someone who had finally confirmed what she had feared. Vanessa recovered first, or tried to. She spoke to Bernard as though this were merely an unfortunate misunderstanding caused by an uncooperative guest. She framed the police presence as a necessary precaution. She described Malcolm as evasive, the Ferrari as suspicious, and the altered company record as justification for every humiliating second that had passed. But her words no longer landed with the same force. power depends on the room believing you are the highest authority present. Vanessa had just lost that illusion. Amina asked Officer Price to review the documents in her case before any further action was taken. This time, no one dismissed the paperwork. The first document established the Ferrari's ownership. The vehicle had been purchased legally, insured properly, and registered through the Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust. The VIN matched, the title matched, the insurance matched, the trust documents matched. There was no theft, no unauthorized possession, no legal basis for impoundment. The car belonged to the trust, and Malcolm Reed was its managing trustee. Officer Price's face changed as he read. It was not dramatic, but it was visible. The confidence he had borrowed from Vanessa drained away, leaving behind the discomfort of a man realizing he had nearly placed handcuffs on an innocent person because someone wealthy had sounded certain. He returned Malcolm's identification with a formality that could not repair the damage, but at least stopped it from growing. The younger officer looked relieved. The security guards looked away. Vanessa refused to surrender. She shifted from accusation to confusion, insisting that the internal Caldwell record still listed the car under corporate hold. Marisol Chen opened her folder. That was the moment Vanessa's fear became unmistakable. Marisol had spent weeks tracing irregular entries across Caldwell's systems. At first, she had believed the problem was sloppy management under pressure from the proposed merger. Then she found the charity transfers. Then, the delayed warranty reimbursements. Then, the executive overrides attached to vehicles used as collateral in internal reports. Finally, that afternoon, she saw the Ferrari record altered less than an hour before Malcolm arrived at the gala. The alteration had not been made by a clerk. It had been made through executive credentials assigned to Vanessa Caldwell's office. The crowd did not understand every technical detail, but they understood enough. They understood that the document Vanessa had used to justify suspicion had been changed from inside her own system. They understood that the man she had accused had shown real paperwork, while she had relied on a record that now looked manufactured. Most of all, they understood that the story they had been recording was not the one they thought. Their phones remained raised, but the mood behind them changed. Curiosity became recognition. Recognition became shame. Vanessa tried to blame Miles. Miles looked as though his soul had left him standing there with a tablet in his hands. For months, he had obeyed her, softened her threats into emails, arranged her meetings, and watched her treat fear as a management tool. Now, with police present and the board chair listening, loyalty became too expensive. He admitted that Vanessa had ordered him to pull the Ferrari's service history and flag it before the gala, claiming she needed leverage over an unnamed trust donor who might oppose the merger. He had not known she would turn that flag into a police accusation. That did not make him innocent, but it made the machinery visible. Bernard Hayes closed his eyes for a moment. Malcolm watched him carefully. Bernard was not a villain, but cowardice in a boardroom can create space for villains to operate. He had allowed Vanessa's aggression because profits had risen. He had accepted her explanations because asking harder questions would have delayed the merger. He had told himself that leadership sometimes required sharp edges. Now those sharp edges had been turned on the very person whose trust kept Caldwell alive. Amina then presented the second set of documents. These were not about the Ferrari. They were about control. The Eleanor Reed Memorial Trust held the controlling interest in Reed Caldwell Holdings, the private entity that owned the majority of Caldwell Prestige Motors. Through that trust, Malcolm Reed possessed the authority Vanessa had spent months pretending she held without limits. He was not a random guest. He was not merely a donor. He was not an outsider trying to impress anyone with a sports car. He was the hidden founder, the principal owner, and the final vote on the merger Vanessa had built her future around. The silence that followed was deeper than the earlier silence. Earlier, people had been quiet because they were waiting to see a man punished. Now they were quiet because they understood. They had watched the owner of the company be treated like a criminal by his own acting CEO. Vanessa stared at Malcolm as if seeing him for the first time made the world unfair to her. That is the strange arrogance of people who judge too quickly. They are not horrified by the harm they caused. They are offended that the person they harmed turned out to have power. In her face, Malcolm saw no real remorse, only calculation collapsing. She was not thinking about the insult to his dignity. She was thinking about the merger bonus slipping away, the board votes dissolving, the headlines forming, and the video evidence spreading faster than her lawyers could contain it. Malcolm finally spoke, but even then, he did not perform anger for the crowd. He made it clear, in a measured way, that the issue had never been whether he could prove he owned the Ferrari. The issue was, what would have happened if he could not? What if he had been a mechanic, borrowing a customer's car with permission? What if he had been a young student from the scholarship program standing beside a vehicle he had been asked to move? What if he had been Jordan, or any worker whose documents were not enough to overcome a powerful person's assumption? Malcolm's calmness forced the crowd to confront the truth Vanessa had tried to hide behind procedure. The problem was not a misunderstanding. It was a system in which certain people were believed first, and others were forced to survive the consequences. Jordan stood near the valet podium, barely breathing. When Malcolm's eyes found him, the young man looked down, ashamed that he had hesitated. Malcolm did not let that shame settle. He acknowledged Jordan's courage in front of everyone, not as a dramatic reward, but as a correction. The first person at that entrance who had tried to protect the truth had not been a board member, an officer, or an executive. It had been a young valet with the most to lose. That fact embarrassed the powerful more than any speech could have. Vanessa attempted one last defense. She claimed she had acted out of concern for company property, but that argument collapsed under its own weight. Amina reminded the officers and the board that concern for property did not explain why Vanessa ignored valid registration, threatened a witness, pushed for impoundment before verification, or used an altered internal record. Marisol added the financial findings. Transfers from the scholarship event budget to consultant accounts tied to the merger campaign, delayed vendor payments hidden under administrative review, and pressure placed on employees who questioned the numbers. The Ferrari incident had exposed the pattern because Vanessa, in her haste to humiliate Malcolm, had reached for the same tools she used everywhere else: intimidation, optics, and manipulated records. Poetic justice does not always arrive with shouting. Sometimes it arrives as a board chair asking for a badge to be surrendered. Bernard removed Vanessa as acting CEO on the spot, pending a formal investigation. The words were quiet, but they struck harder than any public insult she had thrown at Malcolm. The title she had used as a weapon disappeared in front of the same crowd she had tried to impress. Her access to company systems was suspended. The merger vote was postponed indefinitely. The police opened a separate inquiry into the altered record, and the charity fund she had treated as a branding tool was placed under independent protection by the trust she had mocked. Vanessa's face hardened as she realized there would be no graceful exit. Minutes earlier, she had wanted Malcolm removed from the entrance so donors would not feel uncomfortable. Now donors watched as she was escorted away from the gala she had planned to dominate. She had accused Malcolm of not belonging beside the Ferrari. In the end, she was the one who no longer belonged in the building. The same cameras she had welcomed for publicity captured her fall. The same crowd she had tried to command stepped back from her, as though arrogance itself had become contagious. Malcolm did not celebrate. That disappointed some people watching, but it revealed the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge would have demanded humiliation equal to the humiliation Vanessa had attempted. Justice required something more difficult and more lasting. Malcolm wanted the company repaired. He wanted the scholarship protected. He wanted employees free from fear. He wanted the students inside the museum to remember the night, not only as the night a powerful woman was exposed, but as the night a promise survived. The gala did not end. That was Malcolm's decision. Vanessa's removal created chaos, but Malcolm refused to let her failure become the students' punishment. After a delay, the guests were invited back into the main hall. The mood had changed completely. The champagne seemed less important. The speeches sounded thinner. People who had arrived expecting a pleasant evening of charity now carried the uncomfortable knowledge that charity without dignity is only decoration. When Malcolm entered the hall, he did not enter like a conquering hero. He entered slowly, with Jordan beside him and Amina a few steps behind. The red Ferrari remained outside under the lights, no longer a symbol of suspicion, but of everything people had failed to see. Inside the museum, the scholarship applicants watched him with a different kind of attention. Earlier, some had wondered whether they belonged in such a polished room. Now they had seen the man who funded the room nearly thrown out of it. The lesson was painful, but it was also powerful. Belonging, they learned, is not always granted by the people guarding the door. Bernard Hayes took the stage first and admitted, with visible difficulty, that the evening's program had nearly been overshadowed by a failure of leadership. He did not reveal every legal detail, but he acknowledged enough for the room to understand that an apology was owed. Then Malcolm was introduced properly, not as a mysterious donor, not as a trust representative, but as the founder whose principles had shaped Caldwell before ambition distorted them. Some guests applauded too quickly, eager to move from discomfort to redemption. Malcolm let the applause fade before the room could use it to absolve itself. He did not give them the speech they expected. He did not describe his net worth. He did not tell a triumphant story about proving people wrong. Instead, he spoke about Eleanor. He spoke about a woman who believed talent often lives where opportunity refuses to look. He spoke about young mechanics who learn precision from necessity, about students who work night shifts before morning classes, about parents who sacrifice quietly so their children can build something better. He made the room understand that the scholarship was not a public relations gesture. It was a debt paid forward. As he spoke, the meaning of the Ferrari changed again. It was no longer merely a luxury car or even evidence in a public accusation. It became part of a love story. Malcolm explained, without turning grief into spectacle, that the car carried Eleanor's initials because She had taught him to honor the dreams he once felt embarrassed to admit. She had believed that a boy from a forgotten garage could one day own beauty without apologizing for it. The room grew still, not with scandal this time, but with tenderness. Even those who had recorded his humiliation lowered their phones. The scholarship recipients were announced one by one. Jordan was not on the original list because he had already received support through the technical grant program years earlier. But by the end of the evening, Malcolm expanded the initiative. A new fellowship would be created for working students already inside the automotive industry, young people balancing jobs, training, and family obligations. Jordan would become its first mentor trainee, with full tuition support, paid certification leave, and a permanent position in Caldwell's technical development program if he chose it. The announcement was not charity tossed at him for good behavior. It was recognition of what courage had revealed. In the weeks that followed, the video spread far beyond the city. At first, people shared the most dramatic clip. Vanessa accusing Malcolm, the police lights flashing against the Ferrari, the moment Amina arrived with documents. But as longer footage emerged, the conversation changed. Viewers noticed Jordan trying to speak. They noticed Malcolm offering paperwork again and again. They noticed how quickly the crowd believed suspicion when it was spoken by someone expensive. The story became bigger than a Ferrari, bigger than a CEO losing her title, bigger even than one man's vindication. It became a mirror. Caldwell Prestige Motors underwent a reckoning. Malcolm did not burn the company down. He rebuilt its foundation in public. The proposed merger was canceled. An independent audit confirmed misuse of event funds and improper manipulation of internal records. Vanessa faced civil claims, regulatory scrutiny, and the permanent collapse of the image she had curated so carefully. Miles cooperated with investigators and was dismissed from his role. Bernard Hayes resigned from the board after admitting that oversight had failed under his leadership. Marisol Chen was appointed interim president, not because she was flawless, but because she had chosen the truth when silence would have protected her career. The company changed in ways that mattered. Employees received a protected channel for reporting misconduct. Valet workers, porters, mechanics, and junior staff were included in dignity and escalation policies that were not just printed in handbooks, but enforced. Customer contracts were rewritten in plain language. Warranty claims were reviewed. The scholarship fund was expanded and placed under a separate board that included educators, technicians, and former recipients. Malcolm insisted that the people most often ignored by luxury businesses should have a voice in how those businesses measured integrity. As for the Ferrari, Malcolm kept driving it, but not often. He brought it to the museum once each year for the scholarship ceremony, parking it not behind velvet ropes, but near the student entrance, where young people could see it up close. He allowed them to ask questions about the engine, the design, the balance between power and control. He loved those questions because they came from curiosity, not envy. He wanted them to understand that beauty did not belong only to those born near it. It could be studied, built, earned, and honored. 1 year after the incident, a small plaque was installed at the Meridian Auto Museum beside the scholarship wall. It bore Eleanor Reed's name, Malcolm Reed's name, and a sentence simple enough to be remembered by everyone who passed it. It said that dignity is the first door opportunity must open. Malcolm stood before that plaque for a long time after the ceremony ended. No cameras surrounded him then. No crowd demanded a reaction. Jordan, now wearing a technician's jacket instead of a valet uniform, stood nearby and said nothing, because some moments are too full for speech. Malcolm thought about the night Vanessa tried to reduce him to a suspect beside his own car. He thought about the officers, the crowd, the phones, the silence. He thought about how close the truth had come to being delayed by confidence, title, and assumption. He knew that his wealth had helped protect him. His attorney had arrived. His documents had been recognized. His ownership had been too large to ignore. But he also knew that many people never get that kind of rescue. Their truth is smaller on paper, easier to dismiss, and less profitable for strangers to defend. That knowledge kept him humble. It also kept him working. Vanessa eventually faded from headlines, though consequences followed her longer than attention did. She tried to rebuild her reputation through carefully worded statements about stress, misunderstanding, and procedural confusion. But the public had seen too much. More importantly, investigators had seen enough. The world she had built out of image could not survive contact with evidence. For a woman who had valued reputation above character, the punishment was brutally fitting. She had spent years polishing a name while neglecting the truth beneath it. In the end, the name tarnished exactly where the truth had been ignored. Malcolm never said he forgave her publicly. He also never let bitterness become his legacy. Eleanor had taught him that justice should protect the future, not merely punish the past. So he chose to build. He built scholarships. He built protections. He built a company where a young worker could challenge an executive without risking everything. He built the kind of door he wished had opened more easily when he was young. And the red Ferrari remained what it had always been, no matter what Vanessa tried to make it. Not proof of arrogance, not an invitation to envy, not a symbol that one man had become better than anyone else. It was a promise kept. It was a reminder that a boy who once fixed engines under weak garage lights had lived long enough to honor the woman who believed in him. It was also a warning to anyone who judged ownership by appearance, intelligence by accent, dignity by clothing, or worth by the comfort of their assumptions. Because sometimes the quiet man beside the car is not lost. Sometimes he is not lucky. Sometimes he's not trying to impress anyone at all. Sometimes he is the one who built the road, paid for the lights, opened the doors, and still waits patiently to see who will treat him with respect before they know his name. So the next time you see someone standing where you do not expect them to stand, pause before you turn your assumption into a sentence over their life. The truth does not become smaller because it arrives quietly. Dignity does not disappear because someone powerful refuses to recognize it. And kindness, when protected by courage, can outlast arrogance every single time. If this story reminded you that no one should have to prove their humanity before being treated with respect, leave a like. Share it with someone who needs the reminder. And tell us in the comments whether you think Malcolm gave Vanessa exactly the justice she deserved. The judge was about to close the hearing when a 10-year-old boy stood up and asked to question the witness.
Please, just one question.
District Attorney Roland Vance rose immediately, furious that a child was being allowed anywhere near the case.
Grief does not make a child an expert.
Caleb, you do not have to carry this.
I already told them what I remembered.
Judge Helena Cross had seen families cry before, but the boy did not look ready to perform. He looked terrified.
One question, nothing more.
Please let them hear him this time.
Caleb had to stand on a wooden step just to reach the microphone adults had ignored for 2 years.
You all trusted the time, but no one checked it.
Vance called the conviction airtight, but the child's calmness revealed the first crack in his confidence.
Choose your words carefully, boy.
Hidden inside a photograph everyone had already seen was a mistake that had stolen 2 years from an innocent man. Silas watched his son prepare to ask the question every trained adult had failed to ask.
The truth is still here.
That sign, I only turned it after closing.
Then Caleb asked the one question no one else had thought to ask.
What time did your store close on Sunday nights?
Long before Caleb Turner stood in that courtroom, before reporters knew his name, and before one simple question threatened to tear apart a prosecutor's perfect conviction, he knew his father as the man who could make forgotten clocks speak again. Silas Turner owned a narrow repair shop on the oldest street in Briar Creek. The sign above the door read, Turner Clockworks, though time and rain had faded some of the gold lettering. Inside, the walls were crowded with mantel clocks, pocket watches, brass carriage clocks, wooden regulators, and tall grandfather clocks whose pendulums moved with the patience of men who had seen generations come and go. The shop never sounded completely quiet. Even after closing, even when Silas turned off the lights and locked the front door, dozens of clocks continued ticking in different rhythms. Some ran fast, some ran slow. Some chimed several seconds apart, filling the darkness with imperfect music. Caleb loved that sound. While other children spent their afternoons watching cartoons or throwing balls in the street, Caleb sat on a tall stool beside his father's workbench. His feet did not reach the floor, so they swung beneath him while he watched Silas work beneath the yellow light of a desk lamp. Silas handled every clock as if it were alive. He never forced a rusted gear. He never twisted a hand that resisted. He listened first. He watched. He removed each screw carefully, placed every tiny part on dark velvet, and searched for the smallest sign of damage. To most people, a broken clock was only an object that no longer worked. To Silas, it was a witness. A worn tooth on a gear meant the movement had been carrying too much strain. A bent minute hand meant someone had tried to reset it too roughly. A faint scratch inside the case could reveal that an earlier repairman had installed the wrong part. Nothing stopped without a reason, Silas often told Caleb. Every failure left a trace. Caleb remembered one afternoon when an elderly woman brought in a pocket watch wrapped in a white handkerchief. It had belonged to her husband and had not ticked since the morning he died. She could not afford a proper restoration, but she asked Silas whether he could make it run just once more. Silas worked on that watch for 3 evenings. When the woman returned, he placed it gently in her palm. The watch began ticking, soft but steady, and the woman closed her fingers around it as tears filled her eyes. She tried to pay, but Silas refused. He told her some repairs were worth more than money. Ruth Turner loved her husband for moments like that, though she also worried about them. Kindness did not pay the rent. Sentiment did not buy groceries. Their life was always balanced between enough and almost enough. Ruth worked mornings, cleaning rooms at a motel near the highway, and covered evening shifts at a laundromat when bills grew too heavy. Silas repaired clocks, watches, music boxes, and occasionally old mechanical toys. Caleb did his homework at the front counter and ate dinner from paper containers when Ruth worked late. They were not wealthy, but their home had warmth. Silas laughed easily. Ruth sang while cooking. Caleb fell asleep most nights, hearing the faint ticking of the small brass travel clock his father kept beside the kitchen window. Silas had one lesson he repeated more than any other. When time is wrong, everything built on it becomes wrong too. At first, Caleb thought his father was only talking about clocks. A minute hand, placed incorrectly, could cause the chime to strike at the wrong hour. One gear installed out of position could throw the entire mechanism out of rhythm. A small mistake hidden inside the case could make every movement afterward incorrect. Caleb had no idea that those words would one day become the key to his father's freedom. The day everything changed was Sunday, March 10th. It was the first morning after daylight saving time began, the yearly adjustment that pushed clocks forward by 1 hour. Silas disliked it. He spent half the morning walking through the shop, resetting every clock one by one, while Caleb followed him with a notebook. Ruth teased him for treating the time change like a national emergency. Silas replied that people should not move time around carelessly, and then act surprised when the world became confused. Caleb laughed. By midnight, none of them would find the joke funny. Marlowe's Corner Market sat beside County Road 17, a small convenience store with 2 aging gas pumps, a flickering soda sign, and a bell above the entrance that rang half a second after the door opened. Owen Marlowe had owned the store for more than 30 years. After his wife died, the market became more than a business. It gave him somewhere to go each morning, and a reason to keep speaking to people. Behind the register hung a red rooster wall clock. The paint was chipped, one wooden wing was cracked, and the pale face had yellowed with age. Owen's wife had bought it during the first year of their marriage. Even after she died, Owen could not bring himself to remove it. 2 weeks before the robbery, that clock had stopped. Owen considered throwing it away, but Silas offered to repair it. He cleaned the movement, replaced a worn spring, realigned the hands, and stayed long enough to make sure it kept accurate time. When Owen asked what he owed, Silas charged him only for the replacement part. The red rooster clock began ticking again behind the register. No one understood then that it would become the most important witness in Briar Creek. On the night of March 10th, a man entered Marlowe's Corner Market wearing a dark coat and a cap pulled low over his face. The security camera was old and mounted near the ceiling, creating a grainy image that hid more than it revealed. The man appeared tall. His shoulders were broad. His walk looked slightly uneven. He threatened Owen, forced him to open the register, took the cash bag, and left through the front entrance. The security footage displayed a timestamp of 8:18 p.m. Owen called 911 in a frightened, breathless voice. The emergency dispatch system recorded his call at 9:22 p.m. That 1-hour difference should have stopped the investigation before it began. Someone should have asked why a terrified store owner who claimed to call immediately after the robber left had waited more than an hour. No one did. The camera said 8:18, and the number appeared clean, mechanical, and official. It seemed easier to trust than memory. Less than 4 hours later, deputies arrived at the Turner home. The pounding on the door woke Caleb. He came into the hallway barefoot, wearing an oversized sleep shirt, and saw Ruth speaking to 2 officers beneath the porch light. Silas stood behind her. He had returned from work not long before and still smelled faintly of brass polish and machine oil. The deputies asked where he had been that evening. Silas explained that he had repaired the large wall clock inside St. Bartholomew's Church Hall. After finishing, he drove to a supplier's storage facility to collect a spring for an anniversary clock. His electronic access card had been scanned at the storage building at 9:07 p.m. The facility was more than 13 miles from Marlowe's Corner Market. Silas believed that record would protect him. But according to the camera, the robbery had happened at 8:18. The investigators assumed Silas could have robbed the store and then driven to the storage facility afterward. The deputies had already seen the footage. The robber was a tall black man with broad shoulders and an uneven step. Silas had injured his right knee years earlier while carrying a grandfather clock down a staircase. He sometimes limped when tired. He owned a dark coat. He had visited Owen's store 2 weeks before and knew where the camera and register were located. None of those details proved he was the robber. Together, they created a story the deputies were ready to believe. Caleb watched one officer place handcuffs around his father's wrists. The memory never left him. The wet shine of the pavement. Ruth repeating Silas's name. A neighbor's curtain moving across the street. The clocks inside their home ticking while the world outside stopped making sense. Silas turned toward Caleb before the patrol car door closed. He did not promise everything would be fine. Silas respected the truth too much to offer comfort he could not guarantee. He only told Caleb to take care of his mother. By morning, Briar Creek had already judged him. News traveled quickly through the town. A poor black clockmaker had robbed an elderly white shopkeeper. The camera had recorded the crime. Silas had known the store's layout. His business had been struggling. For people who wanted a simple answer, the story fit too easily. Customers stopped entering Turner Clockworks. Some claimed they wanted to wait until the facts were clear, though they had already decided which facts mattered. Others crossed the road rather than pass the shop. Someone wrote the word thief across the front window in black marker. Ruth tried to remove it before Caleb arrived from school, but the stain remained visible beneath the glass. At school, children repeated the words they heard at home. They asked Caleb whether his father had robbed other stores. One boy placed a plastic toy clock on Caleb's desk and joked that perhaps Silas could steal another hour from it. The teacher heard him. She looked away. That was the first time Caleb understood that silence could become permission. District Attorney Roland Vance took control of the case almost immediately. Vance was preparing to run for a state judgeship. He had built his reputation on swift convictions, polished speeches, and promises to protect honest families from crime. He appeared at church breakfasts, charity events, and press conferences. He knew exactly where to stand when cameras arrived and exactly how long to pause before saying the word justice. The Turner case was perfect for him. An elderly victim, a security video, a struggling defendant, a timeline simple enough for television. Vance told reporters the evidence was strong. He praised the deputies for acting quickly. He described Silas as someone who had used the trust of a local business owner to learn the store's vulnerabilities. Before the trial began, Vance had already turned the case into part of his political story. Silas received a court-appointed attorney named Brian Kell. Kell was not cruel. He was exhausted. His desk carried more files than any one lawyer could read carefully. He moved from hearing to hearing, bargaining cases, filling forms, and telling himself that doing something for each client was better than doing nothing. Silas explained the access card record from 907. He explained the repair at St. Bartholomew's. He explained that Owen claimed to have called 911 immediately, yet the emergency log showed 922. Kell wrote a few notes and promised to investigate. But he made the same mistake everyone else had made. He trusted the timestamp. At trial, Roland Vance repeated the time 8:18 until it became the heartbeat of the prosecution's case. At 8:18, the robber entered the store. At 8:18, Owen Marlowe feared for his life. At 8:18, Silas Turner had no verified alibi. The access card scan at 9:07 seemed irrelevant if the robbery occurred almost 50 minutes earlier. Vance suggested Silas had committed the crime, changed his route, and then appeared at the storage building to create distance from the scene. The 911 call at 9:22 was treated as evidence of Owen's trauma. Vance told the jury that a terrified elderly man could not be expected to remember every minute after being threatened. Perhaps Owen had locked the doors. Perhaps he had sat in shock. Perhaps fear had distorted his sense of time. Vance transformed the contradiction into sympathy. Then he delivered the sentence that stayed in Caleb's mind for years. The camera had no reason to lie. It sounded powerful. Mechanical evidence seemed pure. A camera had no prejudice, no fear, no political ambition, and no desire to protect one man or accuse another. But no one asked whether the camera knew the correct time. Brian Kell did not call a security system expert. He did not inspect the recorder's settings. He did not enlarge the background of the footage. He did not ask about the daylight saving time change. He did not ask why the closed sign appeared turned toward the street. He did not ask why a mop bucket was visible near the counter, or why Owen's bank deposit bag had already been placed beside the register. Most importantly, he did not ask about the red rooster clock. Caleb sat behind his mother throughout the trial. He was 8 years old and did not understand every legal term, but he understood tone. He knew when adults were searching for truth and when they were only waiting for their turn to speak. No one was truly listening to Silas. When Silas testified, he spoke calmly. Some members of the jury seemed to expect innocence to sound louder. They expected rage, dramatic denial, or a fist striking the table. Silas had spent his life working around fragile mechanisms. He chose his words carefully. Vance used that caution against him. He made Silas confirm that his business had financial problems. He made him admit that he had been inside Marlowe's store. He made him admit that he knew where the security camera was mounted. He made him confirm that he owned a dark coat and walked with a limp. Each fact proved little by itself. Together, beneath Vance's confident voice, they became a cage. The jury found Silas guilty. Ruth made a sound Caleb had never heard from her before. It was not a scream. It was quieter and more painful, as if something inside her had torn, and there was not enough air left to release it. Silas Turner was sentenced to 16 years in prison. Outside the courthouse, Roland Vance gave a statement praising law enforcement and promising that Briar Creek would remain a town where criminals faced consequences. Cameras flashed while he spoke. That evening, local news described the case as a clean conviction. Caleb would later hate that phrase. Nothing about what followed was clean. Turner Clockworks closed within a month. Ruth tried to keep it alive, but customers never returned. The landlord waited until the legal deadline and changed the locks. Tools, shelves, and unfinished repairs were sold for a fraction of their value. A dealer from another county bought most of the clocks in bulk. Caleb saved only one. It was a small brass travel clock with a cracked glass face. He slipped it beneath his sweater before anyone could attach a price tag. That night, he wound it carefully and placed it beneath his pillow. The ticking was uneven, but it continued. Ruth and Caleb moved into a narrow room behind the laundromat where she worked at night. The walls trembled whenever the large machines entered their spin cycles. The air smelled of detergent, damp clothing, and warm metal. Caleb slept on a small cot beside cardboard boxes. Ruth slept in a folding chair and claimed it was comfortable. Caleb knew she was lying, but it was the kind of lie parents use to protect children from guilt. Every Wednesday, Ruth drove Caleb to visit Silas. The prison was 2 hours away. Caleb hated the metal detector, the locked doors, the plastic chairs, and the guards who spoke to families, as if love were another item that needed inspection. Silas always smiled when they arrived. That smile hurt more than anything. He asked about school. He asked about Ruth's health. He asked whether Caleb had kept the brass clock running. He rarely spoke about the 16-year sentence. Perhaps the number was too large to hold an ordinary conversation. One afternoon, Caleb finally asked why the truth had not saved him. Silas stared through the scratched plastic barrier for a long time. He could have told his son that truth always won in the end. It would have sounded comforting. It would also have been dishonest. Instead, Silas explained that truth did not fail because it was weak. It failed when people stopped looking for it. That sentence followed Caleb home. It remained with him during the long bus ride, through Ruth's exhausted silence, and into the room behind the laundromat. That night, Caleb lay awake with the brass clock ticking beside his pillow. He thought about 8:18. He thought about the access card at 9:07. He thought about the 911 call at 9:22. The numbers were supposed to belong to the same night, but they did not move together. They were like gears from different clocks, forced into the same mechanism. For the first time, Caleb's grief began to change. It did not become hope. Not yet. It became a question. If the law was built from books, records, timestamps, photographs, signatures, and statements, perhaps it was not an invisible monster. Perhaps it was a machine, a massive machine. A machine powerful enough to crush people when the wrong part failed. And every broken machine left a trace. Caleb began going to the Briar Creek Public Library after school. The legal books were stored on a lower shelf near outdated tax manuals. They were heavy, dusty, and filled with words that seemed designed to keep ordinary people outside. Affidavit, transcript, petition, evidentiary hearing, chain of custody, post-conviction relief, procedural default. At first, Caleb understood almost nothing. So he copied the words into a notebook and looked them up one by one. He whispered them beneath his breath until they stopped sounding like locked doors. He searched old newspaper articles. He read court summaries. He learned how to request public records. Ruth tried to stop him. She believed Silas was innocent, but she had already watched the system take her husband, their home, their business, and nearly all her strength. She did not want it to take Caleb's childhood too. She told him some doors were too heavy for a child to open. Caleb asked whether they became lighter when everyone stopped pushing. Ruth had no answer. By the time he turned 9, the library staff recognized him. He came after school, on weekends, and during Ruth's longest shifts. He drew timelines on sheets of paper and taped them together because one page was not large enough to contain everything that felt wrong. He wrote the 3 times repeatedly. 8:18, 9:07, 9:22. That was when Marion Whitaker noticed him. Marion was 73 and had spent 38 years working as a court clerk. She had watched lawyers enter courtrooms full of confidence and leave without understanding the lives they had changed. She knew how cases disappeared beneath paperwork. She knew how a missing signature, an incorrect date, or an unexamined record could become the difference between freedom and prison. Retirement had made her quieter, but it had not made her forget. For several weeks, Marion watched Caleb from across the library. She saw him struggle with court forms too complicated for his age. She watched him feed coins into the photocopier, copying pages from his father's case. One afternoon, she asked what he was working on. Caleb hesitated. Adults often sounded interested just before telling him to stop. He said it was his father's case. When Marion heard the name Silas Turner, her expression shifted. She remembered the trial. She remembered how quickly it had moved. She remembered Roland Vance discussing the conviction at political events. She remembered courthouse employees whispering that Brian Kell had seemed unprepared. Most of all, she remembered thinking that the timeline felt too neat. Marion asked to see Caleb's notes. She read for almost an hour without speaking. Caleb expected her to tell him he misunderstood the law. Instead, she paused at the 911 log, then at the access record, then at the camera timestamp. Finally, Marion told him that if he wanted to understand a broken case, he would need the whole record, not only the pieces adults had allowed him to see. That was how Caleb found his first ally. Marion did not promise to free Silas. She knew too much about the system to offer easy hope. She helped Ruth file requests for transcripts and evidence. She explained legal terms Caleb had misunderstood. She showed him which documents mattered and which only looked important. Most importantly, she did not take the investigation away from him. She guided him, but she allowed him to keep searching. Together, they rebuilt the night of March 10th. The camera said 8:18. Silas's access card said 9:07. The 911 record said 9:22. Owen's first statement said he called police immediately after the robber left. If Owen was telling the truth, the robbery could not have happened at 8:18. Marion requested the original still photographs from the security footage. Weeks later, they arrived in a worn brown envelope. Caleb spread them across a library table. At first, he made the same mistake everyone else had made. He studied the robber. The dark coat, the broad shoulders, the lowered head, the uneven walk. The image was too unclear to identify anyone, yet close enough to Silas's shape to explain why frightened people had stopped looking. Marion watched Caleb struggle with the resemblance. Then she asked what his father would examine if the photograph were a broken clock. Caleb looked up. Marion reminded him that a clockmaker did not stare only at the hand that had stopped. He studied the entire mechanism. So Caleb stopped looking at the robber. He looked at the counter, the coffee machine, the rack of snacks, the mop bucket near the aisle, the bank deposit bag beneath Owen's arm. The sign on the front door turned to show closed. Then Caleb saw the red rooster clock. It hung behind the register, partly hidden beneath glare. The black hands were thin against the pale face, but Caleb had spent years learning to read clocks from difficult angles. The timestamp in the corner of the security image read 8:18 p.m. The red rooster clock showed approximately 9:18. Caleb leaned closer. He checked the next image. The same difference. He checked another. Still 1 hour. His father had repaired that clock 2 weeks before the robbery. Silas had checked its movement and ensured it kept accurate time. Caleb looked at Marion, afraid to trust what he was seeing. Marion reached for a calendar. March 10th was the first day after daylight saving time began. Owen had moved the hands of the wall clock forward by 1 hour, but the old security recorder had not updated automatically. The camera timestamp was 1 hour slow. The robbery had not happened at 8:18. It had happened at 9:18. Suddenly, every piece moved into place. Owen's 911 call at 9:22 came 4 minutes after the robbery, exactly as his first statement claimed. Silas's access card showed him entering a storage facility 13 miles away at 9:07. He could not have reached Marlowe's Corner Market 11 minutes later. For 2 years, Silas Turner had been imprisoned because everyone trusted a camera without checking its clock. The truth had not been missing. It had been ticking in the background of the evidence from the beginning. But finding the truth and proving it in court were not the same thing. Marion knew Roland Vance would fight them. His reputation, his campaign, and perhaps several other convictions depended on keeping the Turner case closed. They would need the security system manual, dispatch records, access logs, maintenance documents, and Owen Marlowe's testimony. They would need to make frightened adults admit that a child had seen what they had ignored. And before Caleb could ask his one question in court, Roland Vance would use every part of his power to make sure the truth never reached the witness stand. Roland Vance learned about the new evidence before the hearing date was announced. By then, Marion had helped Ruth submit the security photographs, the access card record, the emergency dispatch log, and the manual for the old camera system. The documents were enough to force the court to take a second look, but not enough to guarantee justice. Marion knew that courts did not reopen convictions simply because the truth seemed obvious to a family. The truth had to survive procedure, opposition, and the pride of everyone whose reputation depended on the original verdict remaining untouched. Vance understood the danger immediately. If the robbery had taken place at 9:18 rather than 8:18, Silas's conviction did not merely become questionable, it became impossible to defend. The access log placed him more than 13 miles away, 11 minutes before the crime. Owen's emergency call supported the corrected time. The Red Rooster clock supported it. Even the store's closing routine supported it. But Silas was not the only thing Vance could lose. The Turner conviction had appeared in his campaign speeches. He had praised it as proof that his office trusted evidence over excuses. He had used the case to present himself as a prosecutor who moved quickly, protected elderly victims, and refused to be manipulated by emotional defenses. If a 10-year-old boy proved that his office had ignored the most basic question in the case, voters would not see a minor technical error. They would see arrogance. And once people began questioning one conviction, they might begin questioning others. Vance could not allow that. He did not threaten Ruth directly. That would have been too crude and too easy to expose. Instead, a local reporter received an anonymous suggestion that the Turner family was using Caleb's age to create public sympathy. An article appeared describing the new evidence as an emotional theory developed by a grieving child and a retired clerk with no authority to retry the case. The article did not call Caleb foolish. It did something more effective. It made him sound harmless. At school, the whispers returned. Some children said Caleb was pretending to be a lawyer. Others said his mother wanted money from the county. One teacher advised him privately that he should focus on school and leave legal matters to adults. Caleb listened without arguing. Adults had handled the legal matters before. His father was still in prison. Ruth found the article folded beneath their door one morning. Someone had circled the phrase emotional theory in red ink. She tore the page in half, then into smaller pieces, but Caleb had already seen it. He told her it did not matter. Ruth looked at him and recognized the same careful expression Silas used when hiding pain. She wanted to tell Caleb he did not have to be brave all the time. She wanted to take the files away, close the notebooks, and protect what remained of his childhood. But the hearing was now their only path forward, and turning back would not restore anything already lost. So Ruth did what she had done for 2 years. She kept moving. Marion focused on the evidence. She found an archived copy of the camera recorder's operating manual, which confirmed that the system did not automatically adjust for daylight saving time. The clock had to be changed manually through a sequence of menus Owen Marlowe had never learned to use. They obtained a certified copy of Silas's access card scan at 9:07:43 p.m. They confirmed the storage facility was 13.4 miles from Marlowe's Corner Market. Even under ideal conditions, the drive took more than 17 minutes. They also found a service receipt from St. Bartholomew's Church Hall. Silas had signed it at 8:46 p.m. after adjusting the church's large wall clock for the time change. A church custodian remembered seeing him leave. Each piece strengthened the corrected timeline. But the most important witness remained Owen Marlowe. Without Owen confirming his closing routine and the accuracy of the Red Rooster clock, Vance could argue that the wall clock had been wrong, that the photograph was unclear, or that the time difference was only speculation. Marion went to see him. Marlowe's Corner. Market looked older than Caleb remembered. The soda sign still flickered. One gas pump had been covered with a plastic sheet. The bell above the entrance rang too late, sounding only after Marion had stepped fully inside. Owen stood behind the counter with both hands resting on the edge. The Red Rooster clock still hung behind him. It was ticking. Marion introduced herself and explained why she had come. Owen did not ask her to sit. He did not offer coffee. He kept wiping the same section of counter with a cloth that was already dry. At first, he repeated what he had said during the original investigation. The robber had been tall. The man had moved like Silas. He had known the store. The camera showed the time. Marion asked whether he had adjusted the wall clock on the morning of March 10th. Owen's hand stopped moving, only for a second. Then he said he did not remember. Marion asked whether the security recorder had been adjusted. Owen said he did not know. She asked what time he usually closed on Sundays. 9 o'clock, he answered automatically. Then he realized what he had said. His eyes moved toward the rooster clock. Marion saw fear settle over him before he lowered his gaze. A few days earlier, someone from Vance's office had visited the store. The assistant had spoken politely, almost kindly. He reminded Owen that changing his testimony could cause serious problems. People might accuse him of helping convict an innocent man. Silas's family might sue him. Insurance investigators might reopen the robbery claim. Customers might stop trusting him. No one told Owen to lie. They only explained how painful the truth could become. Fear completed the rest. Owen told Marion that 2 years was a long time. He said his memory was unreliable. He said maybe he had flipped the closed sign early that night. Maybe he had prepared the deposit before 9. Maybe the rooster clock had been wrong despite Silas's repair. Marion knew those possibilities had not come from memory. They had been given to him as hiding places. She did not accuse him. She only said that Silas had already paid for Owen's fear with 2 years of his life. Owen looked away. When Marion returned to the laundromat, Caleb knew from her expression that the meeting had gone badly. She spread her notes across the small table. They had the technical evidence, but Owen planned to say he could not remember. Vance would use that uncertainty to attack everything else. He would argue that the wall clock might have been inaccurate, that the store routine could vary, and that the defense was forcing meaning into an unclear photograph. Marion began preparing questions. She wrote them carefully, one after another. Had Owen personally changed the security recorder after daylight saving time? Did he know whether the system updated automatically? Had the red rooster clock been keeping accurate time? Did he call 911 immediately after the robber left? Was the closed sign turned before or after the last customer departed? Did he prepare the bank deposit before or after closing? The list grew longer. Caleb copied the questions and studied them every night. He understood why Marion had written each one. The questions were precise. They were logical. They covered every important detail. But something felt wrong. Whenever Caleb imagined Owen on the witness stand, he saw the old man retreating behind the same answer. I do not remember. A technical question gave him somewhere to hide. A question about the camera allowed him to blame the machine. A question about daylight saving time allowed him to claim confusion. A question about the exact minute allowed Vance to argue that trauma had damaged his memory. Caleb did not need Owen to explain the technology. He needed him to remember his own life. The night before the hearing, Caleb sat on the floor of the room behind the laundromat. Ruth had fallen asleep in the folding chair, with her shoes still on. The building had gone quiet, except for one dryer, turning slowly in the next room. The security photographs lay around Caleb. He studied the image again. The robber stood near the counter. Owen was behind the register. The closed sign had been turned. The mop bucket was near the aisle. The bank deposit bag rested beneath Owen's arm. The red rooster clock showed 9:18. Caleb thought about the way his father repaired clocks. When an entire mechanism seemed wrong, Silas never touched every gear at once. He searched for the single part that explained all the others. Caleb picked up Marion's list of questions. He crossed out the first one, then the second, then another. He continued until nearly every line disappeared beneath his pencil. When Marion arrived the next morning, Caleb handed her the page. Only one idea remained. Marion read it twice. The question did not mention the camera. It did not mention the time change. It did not accuse Owen of lying. It did not sound like a lawyer's question at all. That was precisely why it might work. The courthouse was already crowded when they arrived. News of the hearing had spread through Briar Creek. Reporters filled the hallway. Some people had come because they believed Silas was innocent. Others came because they wanted to see whether a child's theory would collapse under real scrutiny. Roland Vance stood near the courtroom doors, speaking with 2 assistants. His suit was dark, his tie perfectly centered, his expression calm. When he saw Caleb, he gave the boy a brief smile. It was not kindness. It was the smile of a man reminding an opponent that the room belonged to him. Silas was brought into court wearing a plain shirt Ruth had sent through his attorney. Prison had changed him. He was thinner. Gray had begun to appear in his beard. His shoulders curved slightly forward, as though 2 years of being watched had taught him to occupy less space. Caleb wanted to run to him. The rules did not allow it, so father and son looked at one another across the room. Silas glanced at the papers in Caleb's hands, then he gave the smallest nod. It was the same nod he used to give at the workbench when Caleb had finally placed a delicate gear in the correct position. Judge Helena Cross entered, and the courtroom rose. She was known for strict procedure and little patience for courtroom drama. That worried Ruth. It reassured Marion. A judge who disliked drama might be more willing to listen to evidence that did not depend on it. The hearing began with Marion presenting the newly discovered material through the attorney assisting the family. The access record was entered. The 911 log was entered. The service receipt from St. Bartholomew's was entered. The security system manual was entered. Vance challenged every piece. He argued that an access scan proved only that Silas's card had been used, not necessarily that Silas himself had used it. He suggested another person could have carried the card, even though no evidence supported that theory. He said the church receipt did not establish where Silas went afterward. He said the 911 call showed only when Owen contacted police, not when the robbery occurred. He called the wall clock interpretation unreliable because the security image was grainy and taken from an angle. Each argument was weak alone, but Vance delivered them with the confidence of a man who knew certainty could make speculation sound reasonable. Then Owen Marlowe was called to the witness stand. The old man walked slowly. He held his hat in both hands until the clerk told him to set it aside. When he took the oath, his voice trembled. At first, the questions were simple. He confirmed that he owned Marlowe's Corner Market. He confirmed that Silas had repaired the Red Rooster clock 2 weeks before the robbery. He confirmed the store normally closed at 9 on Sunday nights. Then Marion's side asked whether he had changed the wall clock for daylight saving time. Owen looked toward Vance. It was a quick glance. Judge Cross saw it. So did Caleb. Owen said he could not remember. He was asked whether he had changed the security recorder. He said he did not know how. He was asked whether the wall clock had been keeping accurate time. He said he believed so, but could not be certain. The questions moved closer to the central issue, and Owen's answers became less useful. He could not remember. It had been too long. The robbery had frightened him. He might have prepared the deposit early. He might have flipped the closed sign before 9. He might have waited before calling 911. Vance sat at the prosecution table with his hands folded. He did not need Owen to defend the original timeline. He only needed him to make the truth sound uncertain. When Vance questioned him, his tone became gentle. He reminded Owen that the night had been traumatic. He asked whether fear could affect memory. Owen agreed. He asked whether Owen had ever personally inspected the internal settings of the security recorder. Owen said no. He asked whether Owen could swear that the rooster clock had been perfectly accurate that evening. Owen hesitated. Then he said no. Vance thanked him and sat down. The faintest satisfaction crossed his face. The defense had found a discrepancy, but he believed he had contained it. A frightened witness, an old clock, and a technical manual were not enough to overturn a jury's verdict if he could keep doubt scattered across the room. Judge Cross reviewed her notes. She asked whether either side had additional evidence. Marion looked at Caleb. This was the moment they had discussed, but now that it had arrived, it felt impossible. Caleb's mouth had gone dry. The courtroom seemed larger than before. The distance between his chair and the witness stand felt longer than the distance from Briar Creek to the prison. Ruth placed a hand over his. She did not tell him he had to do it. That helped him stand. The movement was small, but the courtroom noticed. Caleb rose beside the defense table. Roland Vance turned. Caleb asked the judge for permission to put one question to Owen Marlowe. The courtroom erupted in murmurs. Vance was on his feet immediately. He objected that Caleb was a child, not counsel. He said allowing the boy to participate would turn a serious legal proceeding into emotional theater. He warned that grief was not evidence, and sympathy could not replace procedure. He spoke as though he were protecting the dignity of the court. But Caleb watched his jaw tighten. The prosecutor was afraid. Judge Cross called for silence. She looked at Marion, then at the attorney assisting the Turners, then at Caleb. She asked whether the proposed question had been reviewed. Marion confirmed that it had. She explained that Caleb's question concerned the witness's established business routine and would not require legal argument. Vance objected again. Judge Cross stopped him. She said the purpose of the hearing was to determine whether a man had been imprisoned under a materially false timeline. If a relevant question had been overlooked because the person who thought of it happened to be 10 years old, the court would not protect its pride by refusing to hear it. She allowed Caleb one line of inquiry. No speech. No argument. Only the question. Caleb stepped toward the witness stand. The microphone stood above his mouth. A deputy retrieved a small wooden platform from beside the clerk's desk and placed it beneath his feet. The sight of the boy standing on that box changed something in the room. For 2 years, adults with badges, titles, degrees, and authority had controlled Silas Turner's fate. Now his son needed a wooden step simply to be tall enough for them to hear him. Caleb looked at Owen. The old man could not hold his gaze. Caleb did not ask about the timestamp. He did not ask about the camera manual. He did not ask whether the rooster clock had been accurate. Instead, he asked what time Marlowe's Corner Market normally closed on Sunday nights. Owen blinked. The question was so ordinary that his prepared fear had nowhere to go. He answered automatically. 9 o'clock. Caleb asked whether Owen usually counted the register before closing or after closing. Vance rose. He objected that Caleb had been allowed one question, not a cross-examination. Judge Cross looked at Marion. Marion explained that the question was part of the same line of inquiry concerning store closing routine. The judge allowed Caleb to continue, but warned him to remain focused. Caleb asked again. Owen said he counted the register after closing. Caleb asked whether he turned the sign on the front door to closed before beginning the count. Owen's fingers tightened around the edge of the witness chair. He said yes. Caleb looked at the enlarged security photograph displayed beside the judge. His voice trembled, but he did not stop. He asked why, if the robbery had happened at 8:18, the photograph showed the closed sign already turned, the mop bucket pulled out, the bank deposit bag placed beside the register, and Owen performing the tasks he had just admitted he only did after the store closed at 9. No one moved. The question was not loud. It carried no accusation. That made it more powerful. Caleb was not asking Owen to understand machinery. He was asking him to remember the ordinary rhythm of his own life. Owen turned toward the image. For 2 years, everyone had directed his attention toward the robber. The coat, the shoulders, the height, the uneven walk. He had stared at the figure so often that the rest of the image had become invisible. Now he saw the store. He saw the sign. He saw the deposit bag. He saw the mop. He saw himself standing behind the counter in the familiar posture he used every Sunday after locking the door. Something changed in his face. Vance saw it and stood again. He argued that the question was misleading. He said routines could change. He said Owen might have closed early. He said the defense was manipulating an elderly witness through emotional details. His words came faster now. Too fast. Owen raised one hand. The gesture was weak, but it stopped the prosecutor. He said he remembered the mop. His voice was barely above a whisper. The courtroom leaned closer. Owen remembered pulling it from the storage area because the floor near the drink cooler had been sticky. He remembered the handle falling against the freezer after the robber left, making a hollow sound that startled him. He remembered turning the sign to closed. He remembered preparing the bank deposit. He remembered looking at the rooster clock because his wife had once trained him never to leave cash in the store after 9. Then he looked more closely at the clock in the photograph. The color left his face. Owen said Silas had repaired that clock. He said it had been keeping accurate time. He said he had moved the hands forward on the morning of March 10th because of daylight saving time. He remembered complaining about losing an hour. He remembered checking the rooster clock several times during the day because he did not trust himself to have adjusted it correctly. Judge Cross asked him directly whether the robbery had occurred before or after the store's normal closing time. Owen began to cry. After, he said. The word fell into the courtroom like a stone into still water. The robbery happened after 9. Marion stood and requested permission to display the enlarged photograph beside the certified records. The judge allowed it. The timestamp in the corner read 8:18 p.m. The rooster clock showed approximately 9:18. The emergency call was received at 9:22. Silas's access card had been scanned 13 miles away at 9:07:43. The church receipt placed him at St. Bartholomew's until 8:46. The camera manual confirmed that the recorder did not automatically update for daylight saving time. What had once seemed like disconnected details now aligned with painful precision. The camera was 1 hour slow. The robbery happened at 9:18. Silas Turner could not have been there. For 2 years, the prosecution had treated the camera timestamp as the strongest evidence in the case. It had been the weakest clock in the entire story. Owen lowered his head and apologized. At first, no one knew whether he was speaking to Silas, Caleb, Ruth, or the judge. Then he turned toward the defense table. He told Silas he was sorry. He said fear had convinced him that uncertainty was safer than truth. He admitted Vance's office had warned him about lawsuits, insurance problems, and public blame if his memory changed. No one had ordered him to lie. They had only made honesty feel dangerous. Silas did not answer. His face remained still, but tears filled his eyes. The truth he had repeated for 2 years was finally being spoken by someone the court had always considered worthy of belief. Roland Vance attempted to recover. He argued that Owen's renewed memory had been influenced by Caleb's questions. He said the wall clock could still have been inaccurate. He insisted that the court should not overturn a jury verdict based on an emotional reconstruction of store routine. Judge Cross asked whether his office had verified the security recorder's time settings before the original trial. Vance said the footage had been authenticated. The judge repeated the question. Had anyone verified the clock? Vance began explaining that the timestamp had been accepted by investigators. Judge Cross interrupted. She asked whether his office had compared the 8:18 timestamp with the 9:22 emergency call. Vance said trauma could explain a delayed report. She asked whether his office had investigated the access card scan at 9:07. He said the scan did not prove Silas personally used the card. Judge Cross asked whether the prosecution had presented any evidence that someone else possessed it. Vance had no answer. She asked whether the defense had received enlarged stills, clearly showing the rooster clock. Vance said the photographs had been available in the evidence file. The words harmed him more than he realized. Available. The truth had been available. The wall clock had been visible. The 911 record had existed. The access scan had existed. The daylight saving time change had been public knowledge. None of it had been hidden. It had simply been treated as less important than the story Vance wanted the jury to believe. Judge Cross recessed the hearing. The courtroom erupted the moment she left. Reporters rushed into the hallway. People spoke over one another. Deputies tried to keep the aisles clear. Ruth remained seated, one hand pressed over her mouth. Marion gathered the papers carefully, though her fingers shook. Caleb stepped down from the wooden platform. The adrenaline left him so quickly that his knees nearly failed. Then Silas called his name. Caleb turned. For the first time in 2 years, there was no glass between them. A deputy allowed Silas to move closer while the court remained in recess. Father and son stood only a few feet apart, both uncertain what the rules permitted. Silas reached out his hand. Caleb took it. The hand felt thinner than he remembered, but it was warm. Silas looked at his son with pride, gratitude, and pain so deep that no single expression could hold all of it. He did not say Caleb had saved him. That would have placed too much weight on a child already carrying more than he should. He only said Caleb had listened. Caleb understood. His father had taught him that every broken thing left a trace. Caleb had simply refused to stop searching for it. When Judge Cross returned, the courtroom rose again. Her expression was controlled, but her voice carried a different weight. She reviewed the evidence slowly. The original prosecution had relied on a robbery time of 8:18 p.m. That time came solely from an unverified security camera timestamp. The recorder had not been adjusted after daylight saving time. The store's wall clock showed approximately 9:18. The witnesses' established closing routine supported a post-9 o'clock robbery. The emergency call at 9:22 supported that timeline. The access card record placed Silas Turner more than 13 miles away at 9:07. The discrepancy was not minor. It destroyed the prosecution's timeline. Judge Cross said the original jury had never been given the opportunity to consider the corrected time. The defense attorney had failed to investigate material evidence. The prosecution had presented the camera timestamp as objective truth without confirming its accuracy. Then she looked directly at Silas. She said the conviction could not stand. Ruth folded forward as if the strength holding her upright for 2 years had suddenly been removed. Marion caught her before she slipped from the bench. Caleb stared at the judge. He heard the words, but his mind could not immediately make them real. The conviction was vacated. Silas Turner was to be released from custody, while the state determined whether any lawful prosecution could continue without the false timeline. Judge Cross added that given the corrected evidence and the absence of reliable identification, the court saw no legitimate basis for holding him further. For 2 years, Silas had measured his life by prison bells, meal schedules, locked doors, visiting hours, and lights-out commands. Now a judge told him he could go home. Silas closed his eyes. A tear moved down his face. The courtroom began to react, but Judge Cross raised her hand. She was not finished. She said the hearing had revealed failures too serious to be treated as an isolated mistake. The prosecution had relied on technical evidence without verifying it. Contradictory records had been dismissed. A poor defendant's alibi had been treated as an inconvenience rather than a constitutional obligation. She ordered that the Attorney General's office receive the full record of the case. She also requested an independent review of other convictions prosecuted by Roland Vance, in which disputed surveillance timestamps had served as central evidence. The color drained from Vance's face. There was the consequence he had not prepared for. For years, he had built his reputation on clean timelines, decisive prosecutions, and cameras he claimed could not lie. Now those same timelines would be reopened. The evidence he had used to close doors would be used to open files. His career would not be destroyed by a political rival. It would be destroyed by the question he had been too arrogant to ask. The courtroom adjourned. Outside, reporters crowded the courthouse steps. Cameras flashed as Silas emerged beside Ruth, Caleb, and Marion. The late afternoon sky stretched above them without bars, concrete, or razor wire. Silas stopped walking. He looked upward. Caleb watched his father study the open sky, as if it were another kind of clock, too wide to measure and too beautiful to trust immediately. Reporters shouted questions. Did he forgive the prosecutor? Would he sue the county? How did it feel to be free? Was Caleb a genius? Silas did not answer at first. Then he said, the truth had been there from the beginning. His family should never have needed a child to find what trained adults had refused to examine. It was not the triumphant statement the reporters expected. It was more powerful than triumph. It was an indictment. That evening, Silas did not return to the home he remembered. The old house was gone. Turner Clockworks was gone. The workbench, the shelves, the clocks, and the faded sign had been sold or scattered. Freedom returned him to a world that had continued moving without him. He went instead to the narrow room behind the laundromat. Ruth opened the door. For a moment, Silas stood among the boxes, the folding chair, Caleb's small cot, and the machines vibrating through the wall. No one knew what to say. Caleb had imagined his father's return 1,000 times. He had imagined laughter, celebration, and the instant restoration of everything the conviction had taken. But justice did not rewind time. It only stopped the lie from taking more. Silas placed his small bag of prison belongings on the floor. Then he noticed the brass travel clock with the cracked face sitting beside Caleb's bed. Caleb had kept it running. Silas picked it up carefully and held it near his ear. The ticking was uneven. Still alive. He looked at Caleb and smiled. It was the first smile his son had seen that didn't have prison glass behind it. But freedom would not erase what had happened. Roland Vance's downfall was only beginning. Owen Marlowe still had to face the cost of his fear. Ruth still carried 2 years of exhaustion inside her. Silas had returned home, but part of him remained trapped in schedules, locked doors, and memories no judge could vacate. And Caleb, now praised by the same town that had once mocked him, would soon learn that being proven right did not automatically make the world kind. The case had ended. The healing had not. Freedom did not arrive like the ending of a story. That was the first thing Caleb learned after Silas Turner walked out of the courthouse and the people of Briar Creek began calling him innocent. For 2 years, the town had treated Silas as though a prison sentence could define the whole of a man. Then, in a single afternoon, the same town tried to reverse itself with headlines, handshakes, apologies, and expressions of shock. But a changed headline could not return a stolen year. It could not rebuild Turner Clockworks. It could not erase the nights Ruth had slept in a folding chair behind the laundromat. It could not give Caleb back the part of his childhood spent studying court transcripts beneath buzzing library lights. And it could not teach Silas how to feel free simply because a judge had opened a door. On his first night home, Silas barely slept. Caleb woke before dawn and saw his father sitting at the small table beside the brass travel clock. The room was dark, except for the weak light coming through the laundromat window. Outside, one of the machines had entered its final spin cycle, making the wall tremble gently. Silas held the clock near his ear. He wound it, listened, adjusted the crown, and listened again. The clock did not need that much attention. Caleb knew it. Silas knew it too. But after 2 years of guards, searches, count times, locked doors, and hands that were never allowed to move without permission, his fingers needed something delicate to trust him again. Caleb remained near the doorway. He wanted to say something comforting. He wanted to tell his father the nightmare was over. But Silas had taught him not to make claims that time had not proven. The nightmare had changed. That was not the same as ending. Silas noticed him and placed the clock on the table. He apologized for waking him. Caleb said the machines had done that. They both knew it was not true. For several minutes, father and son sat in silence. Then Silas asked whether Caleb had wound the clock every day. Caleb admitted that he had sometimes wound it twice because he was afraid it would stop. Silas examined the cracked glass face and smiled faintly. He said a clock did not need to look untouched in order to keep going. Sometimes the crack became part of the way a person remembered what it had survived. Caleb understood that his father was not only talking about the clock. Ruth understood too. She had spent 2 years surviving through movement. Motel rooms in the morning, laundry in the evening, prison visits on Wednesdays, bills sorted at night. She had lived so long without permission to collapse that when Silas returned, her body did not know how to rest. She continued waking before her alarm. She continued saving food as if the next meal were uncertain. Whenever an unfamiliar number appeared on her phone, fear moved through her before reason could catch it. At the grocery store, she checked prices twice and then checked them again. Silas once told her she did not have to work both jobs anymore. Ruth looked at him as though he had suggested she step from a moving train. She had learned not to trust stability. A conviction could take a husband. A landlord could take a shop. A town could take a reputation. A single mistake could take everything while insisting it was following procedure. Ruth loved that Silas had come home, but love did not automatically make her feel safe. Some nights, they sat beside one another without speaking. They did not need to explain the distance. It had been built from prison walls, collect calls, financial fear, and 2 years of learning how to live separately while still believing they belonged together. They began repairing that distance in small ways. Silas walked Ruth to the motel before sunrise. Ruth brought him coffee while he sorted through the few tools that remained. They ate dinner together even when no one had much appetite. Sometimes they spoke about what had happened. Sometimes they chose not to. Caleb watched them and learned that healing rarely arrived through one powerful conversation. More often, it came through ordinary acts repeated until the body began to believe the danger had passed. The town had its own way of reacting. Some people came to apologize. The first was an elderly woman whose mantel clock Silas had repaired years earlier. She arrived at the laundromat holding a pie and crying before Ruth opened the door. She admitted she had believed the news reports. She admitted she had stopped visiting the shop because she had been afraid of what neighbors might say. She did not ask Silas to tell her everything was fine. She simply said she had failed him. Silas accepted the pie. He did not immediately accept the apology. The woman seemed to understand. Others came with longer explanations. They said the evidence had looked convincing. They said everyone had trusted Roland Vance. They said no ordinary person could have known the camera was wrong. What they wanted was not forgiveness. They wanted relief from the discomfort of knowing they had chosen the easiest story. Ruth had little patience for those apologies. She listened when she felt able. When she did not, she closed the door. Silas never criticized her for it. He understood that forgiveness offered under pressure was only another form of surrender. At school, Caleb's world changed almost overnight. The same principal who had once advised him not to bring attention to his father's case called him into the office and said the entire school was proud. A teacher suggested holding an assembly in his honor. Children who had mocked him now wanted to sit beside him at lunch. One boy asked whether Caleb remembered him. Caleb remembered him perfectly. He remembered the toy clock placed on his desk. He remembered the joke about his father stealing time. He remembered the teacher looking away. The boy apologized. Not well. He said he had only repeated what other people were saying. Caleb looked at him and realized most cruelty traveled that way. It passed from one frightened or careless person to another, until no one felt responsible for carrying it. Caleb did not say they were friends again. He said they could start by being honest. That answer spread through the school before lunch. Some students began calling him the courtroom boy. Others called him the clock boy. Reporters called him a legal prodigy. A television producer called Ruth and offered to fly the family to New York for an interview. Another wanted to build an entire program around Caleb's question. Ruth refused most of them. The first time she agreed to a local interview, she regretted it almost immediately. The reporter repeatedly asked Caleb how it felt to be a hero. Caleb tried to explain that he had not wanted to become a hero. He had wanted his father to come home. The reporter asked whether Caleb planned to become a lawyer. Caleb said he was 10. The moment never appeared in the broadcast. Instead, the program used a dramatic photograph of him standing on the wooden platform beneath the courtroom microphone. The caption called him the boy who defeated a prosecutor. Silas switched off the television. He told Caleb that people liked stories with one hero and one villain because complicated truth made them uncomfortable. But no child should have needed to defeat anyone. The adults should have done their jobs before Caleb ever opened the first law book. Caleb asked whether he should stop speaking about the case. Silas said no. He should speak when the truth might help someone. But he should never let strangers convince him that his pain belonged to them. The formal dismissal of the charges came 3 weeks after the hearing. The document arrived in a thin white envelope. Ruth held it for nearly an hour before opening it. She had imagined that moment during sleepless nights, but the real paper seemed too light for what it carried. It contained several paragraphs of legal language and a few lines stating that the state would not continue prosecution. Case dismissed. Conviction vacated. No further basis for detention. Ruth read the words twice. Then she began laughing. The sound startled Caleb. It was not joy exactly. It was the sound of a body releasing pressure through whatever opening remained. Silas placed his hand on the document. For 2 years, the state had used paper to define him as guilty. Now another piece of paper admitted that the first one should never have existed. He did not smile. He asked Ruth to place the dismissal beside the cracked brass clock. The two objects remained together on the small table for weeks. Proof that the law had corrected itself. Proof that correction had come too late. While the Turner family tried to rebuild, Roland Vance tried to control the damage. He released a public statement claiming he respected the court's decision and remained committed to the integrity of the justice system. He described the incorrect timestamp as an unusual technical problem that could not reasonably have been anticipated during the original prosecution. He did not mention the 911 call. He did not mention the access card record. He did not mention the photograph that had been available from the beginning. And he did not mention the pressure placed on Owen Marlowe before the hearing. For a few days, the explanation worked. Vance still had supporters. Some insisted that one mistake should not destroy a career. Others said he had acted in good faith. His campaign team attempted to move forward, quietly removing references to the Turner conviction from speeches and promotional material. Then the Independent Review found another case. 6 years earlier, a warehouse worker named Thomas Reed had been accused of helping burglarize an electronics store. Surveillance footage appeared to place a vehicle similar to his near the building shortly after midnight. Reed claimed he had been inside a distribution center at the time, but the prosecution argued that another employee could have used his identification badge. The camera timestamp had never been independently verified. Reed had accepted a plea bargain after his public defender warned that juries trusted video more than testimony. He had served 3 years. A review of the recording system showed that its internal clock was 27 minutes fast. The corrected timeline supported Reed's workplace alibi. His conviction was reopened. Then came another case. A young mother had been convicted of participating in a pharmacy theft, based partly on video from a neighboring parking lot. She had insisted she was collecting her child from an emergency clinic across town. Clinic records appeared to conflict with the timestamp, but Vance's office dismissed them as potentially inaccurate. The camera had changed time zones after a software reset. Another case involved a gas station robbery and a recorder that had lost power several days before the crime. When it restarted, its clock reverted to a default time. Investigators never checked. Not every reviewed conviction collapsed. Some remained supported by fingerprints, witness identification, or confessions. But enough cases showed the same habit. Vance's office treated technical evidence as absolute when it helped the prosecution. When conflicting records supported a defendant, they were labeled confusion, coincidence, or manipulation. The problem was no longer one broken camera. It was a philosophy. Roland Vance had not always needed to invent facts. He had simply decided which facts deserved authority. The newspapers that once praised his decisiveness began printing detailed timelines of his cases. Donors stopped returning calls. Political allies who had attended his fundraisers appeared on television, discussing the importance of accountability. His campaign for state judge collapsed within 2 months. The state bar opened an inquiry. The attorney general requested internal emails and case files. Former employees began speaking anonymously about pressure to preserve conviction rates. One assistant admitted that prosecutors were rewarded for closing cases quickly and discouraged from exploring alternative timelines once an arrest had been made. Vance resigned before the investigation ended. In his resignation statement, he claimed he did not want his personal situation to distract from the work of justice. Marion read the sentence aloud while sitting at Ruth's small table. She laughed until her eyes watered. Silas did not laugh. He said powerful men often called the truth a distraction when it finally entered the room without permission. The Turner case became known across the state. But Silas wanted less attention, not more. He struggled to enter crowded places. He disliked people standing behind him. He ate quickly, then apologized when he noticed Ruth watching. He woke before sunrise and sometimes folded his blankets with prison precision before remembering no one would inspect them. He visited the old Turner Clockwork storefront only once. Caleb found him standing across the street. The faded blue door had been painted gray. The window now displayed advertisements for tax preparation and payday loans. Nothing remained of the clocks, the workbench, or the quiet afternoons Caleb had spent sorting brass screws beside his father. Silas stared for a long time. Caleb asked whether he wanted the shop back. Silas shook his head. He said the strange thing about losing a place was that the walls continued standing as though they had not witnessed anything. A man could lose years, customers, reputation, and sleep, while the bricks remained available for someone else's sign. Caleb asked whether they would ever open another shop. Silas did not answer immediately. He looked toward the public library at the end of the street. Then he said perhaps, "Not there." Some rooms held the wrong silence. The new shop began as an idea Marion refused to let disappear. She found a narrow vacant property beside the Briar Creek Public Library. It had once been a used bookstore. The ceiling leaked near the back, one window would not open, and the floorboards carried years of dust. But morning light filled the front room. The location felt right. On one side stood the library where Caleb had learned to read the law. On the other would stand the place where Silas repaired time. The family did not yet have enough money. A civil suit against the county would take years. Donations had arrived after the hearing, but Ruth distrusted sudden generosity. Some people who contributed had not offered a single meal during the 2 years Silas was imprisoned. Silas told her help did not become useless, simply because guilt had brought it. They could accept the wood, paint, tools, and shelves without pretending every motive was pure. A legal foundation created a small recovery grant. St. Bartholomew's Church organized a fundraiser. The church custodian who had seen Silas on the night of the robbery donated several old workbenches. A retired carpenter repaired the floor. Marion arrived carrying boxes of broken courthouse clocks and announced that no new repair shop should open without enough unfinished work to create immediate regret. They cleaned the space together. Ruth scrubbed the windows. Caleb sorted donated tools. Silas repaired shelves, then repaired them again because he did not trust the first attempt. Some volunteers worked quietly. Others apologized while holding paintbrushes. Ruth allowed them to speak. She did not promise absolution. Above the entrance, Silas painted the new name by hand. Turner & Son Clockworks. Caleb stared at the sign for so long that Silas asked whether the spelling was wrong. Caleb said his name did not belong there. His father was the real clockmaker. Silas looked genuinely offended. He told Caleb that without him, there would be no shop and no clockmaker to reopen it. Caleb had kept the work alive when every adult around him had declared it finished. Below the shop name, Caleb painted a smaller sentence. "We restore what time almost took away." Silas complained that it sounded too poetic for a repair shop. Ruth cried when she saw it. Then Silas stopped complaining. Before the shop opened, Owen Marlowe came to see them. He did not arrive with reporters. He did not come during the fundraiser or stand where others could watch him apologize. He went to the laundromat on a quiet afternoon, carrying a cardboard box. Ruth saw him through the glass door and became still. For 2 years, Owen had been presented as the innocent victim and Silas as the dangerous man who had harmed him. Now Owen stood outside looking smaller than the box in his hands. Ruth considered refusing to let him enter. Silas told her it was her choice. That mattered. For so long, other people had controlled what happened to their family. Even a small choice deserved respect. Ruth opened the door. Owen stepped inside. He did not begin with excuses. He did not describe his fear of the robber or explain how Vance's office had influenced him. He did not ask Silas to understand how difficult the situation had been. He said he was sorry. He admitted that before the hearing, Vance's assistant had warned him about lawsuits, insurance investigations, and public blame. He admitted that no one had ordered him to lie. They had only shown him the consequences of remembering correctly. Owen had chosen fear. Silas had paid for it. Owen placed the box on the table. Inside was the red rooster clock. Its hands had been removed and wrapped in paper. Dust covered the chipped wooden body. Without the hands, the pale face looked strangely empty. Owen said he could no longer keep it in the store. Every time he looked at it, he saw the truth he had refused to face. But the clock had belonged to his wife, and he could not throw it away. He asked Silas to repair it one more time. Not for Marlowe's corner market, for his wife's grave. Ruth looked at Silas. Caleb looked at the clock. Silas remained silent for a long time. People often imagine forgiveness as a sudden, beautiful decision. Caleb learned that day that real forgiveness could feel more like opening the back of a damaged clock. A person did not know what condition the mechanism was in until the cover came off. Some parts might be cleaned, some might need replacement, some might never work as before. Finally, Silas agreed to repair it. Owen released a breath. Then Silas said he would charge him a fair price. Not more because of what happened. Not less because of guilt. Fair. Owen nodded immediately. He seemed relieved to pay. The price acknowledged that repair required labor and that the past had carried a cost. Before leaving, Owen apologized to Ruth. She told him she was not ready to forgive him. He lowered his head and said he understood. That was the first moment Caleb believed Owen's remorse might be real. True remorse did not demand comfort from the people it had harmed. Silas and Caleb repaired the rooster clock in the back of the new shop before opening day. They placed it beneath the workbench lamp. Silas removed the back while Caleb arranged the screws on dark velvet. The movement was dirty. One gear had worn unevenly. The minute hand had been bent during removal. Dust had gathered around the spring. The clock had not been destroyed. It had been neglected. Caleb watched his father clean each part. For the first time since prison, Silas's movements became fully steady. His hands remembered a language the rest of him was still relearning. Caleb polished the gear teeth. Silas adjusted the spring. Together, they realigned the hands. When Silas returned the movement to its case and wound it, nothing happened. Caleb's heart sank. Silas waited. He moved the pendulum gently. The clock ticked once, then again. The rhythm strengthened. Ruth stood in the doorway. Marian had stopped sorting boxes in the front room. All four listened. The sound was soft, steady. No one claimed the clock had redeemed the suffering. A repaired object could not return 2 years. But its ticking carried a meaning none of them needed to explain. The truth had been there all along. It had waited in the background until someone looked closely enough to hear it. Opening day arrived 1 year after Silas's release. Caleb wore a clean shirt. Ruth placed flowers in the window. Marion brought a cake that leaned to one side and insisted that perfectly straight cakes should never be trusted. At 9 o'clock, Silas stood beside the front door. For 2 years, other people had controlled every door he entered and left. Prison doors opened by command. Courtroom doors opened under guard. Even the laundromat room belonged to someone else. This door belonged to him. He turned the sign to open. The bell rang cleanly. For several minutes, no one came. Then an elderly woman entered with a pocket watch wrapped in a handkerchief. A church deacon followed with a mantel clock and an apology he could not say without looking at the floor. A young mother brought a cheap plastic clock shaped like a sunflower. She admitted it would cost less to buy a new one, but it had belonged to her grandmother. Silas accepted every repair with the same attention. By noon, the shelves were full. The town had not become perfect. Some people came because they were sorry. Some came because the Turners were now part of a story everyone wanted to stand beside. Some claimed they had always doubted the conviction, though Ruth remembered their silence clearly. She let them enter. She did not let them rewrite the past. Owen collected the rooster clock 2 days later. Silas placed it on the counter between them. The hands now moved accurately. The chipped paint remained. Silas had offered to restore the wooden body, but Owen asked him not to. He wanted the cracks to remain visible. He paid the full price. Before leaving, he looked at Caleb and said, he hoped the boy became whatever kind of man he wanted to become, not what strangers expected after the hearing. Caleb did not know how to respond. He nodded. Owen carried the clock away with both hands. Later, Silas framed an enlarged section of the original security photograph and hung it above the workbench. He cropped out the robber. He removed the counter and most of the store. Only the rooster clock and the timestamp remained. The timestamp read 8:18. The clock showed 9:18. Customers often asked why he kept an image connected to such a painful period. Silas always answered the same way. The truth was there from the beginning. The independent review of Vance's cases continued for more than a year. Thomas Reed's conviction was overturned. The young mother accused in the pharmacy case received a new trial, and the charges were dismissed after investigators confirmed her clinic alibi. Another man's sentence was reduced after hidden timeline inconsistencies undermined the prosecution's version of events. The Turner Review, as newspapers began calling it, did not prove every convicted person innocent. It did something more important and less dramatic. It forced the county to look again. New rules required independent verification of digital timestamps before trial. Surveillance systems had to be checked for time zone errors, power resets, and daylight saving time settings. Prosecutors could no longer present electronic time data as unquestionable without documenting how it had been verified. Marion became involved in a small legal aid project reviewing evidence in old cases. She complained constantly about the workload while arriving early every morning. Caleb continued visiting her at the library. He read appeals, evidence standards, and cases involving mistaken identification. He did not study because he believed the law was pure. He had seen what happened when law was handled carelessly. He studied because the law was too powerful to be left only to people who enjoyed hearing themselves speak. No one forced him to decide whether he would become a lawyer. Silas told him he had already spent enough of his childhood solving adult failures. So Caleb returned to school, repaired clocks on Saturdays, played basketball badly, and sometimes went entire days without thinking about a courtroom. That was its own kind of victory. 2 years after Silas's release, Judge Helena Cross visited Turner and Son Clockworks just before closing. She came alone, without robes, staff, or cameras. In her hands was a small wooden desk clock. Silas welcomed her politely. Caleb looked up from his homework. Judge Cross explained that the clock had belonged to her father. It had stopped years earlier, but she had kept it on her desk because some things remained important even when they no longer moved. She placed it on the counter. Then she looked at Caleb. She told him that courtrooms were filled with trained voices, confident voices, expensive voices, and voices accustomed to being obeyed. But during Silas's hearing, the smallest voice in the room had asked the clearest question. Caleb lowered his eyes. Praise still made him uncomfortable. Silas rescued him by asking the judge what seemed to be wrong with the clock. Judge Cross smiled and admitted she did not know. She said she had learned not to assume. After she left, Caleb asked his father whether justice had finally been done. Silas turned the judge's clock over in his hands. He listened to the silence inside it. Then he said, "Justice had begun." Caleb understood the difference. Done would mean the years returned. Done would mean Turner Clockworks never closed. Done would mean Ruth never slept in a chair. Caleb was never mocked. Owen never hid behind fear. And Vance never built a career by transforming uncertainty into guilt. Begun meant something smaller. Silas was home. The lie had been named. Several forgotten cases had been reopened. People were checking the clocks. After great harm, beginning was sometimes the only honest miracle available. That evening, Caleb and Silas closed the shop together. Ruth had gone ahead to prepare dinner. Marion had left a stack of papers on the counter with a note demanding coffee before anyone asked her to read them. The library lights glowed next door. Caleb turned off the front display. Around him, dozens of clocks continued ticking. They did not tick together. Some moved half a second ahead. Some fell slightly behind. Some sounded deep and formal. Others clicked softly. Yet each was being watched, adjusted, and cared for. The sound had once filled Caleb's childhood. Then it disappeared. Now it had returned. Not unchanged. Nothing truly returned unchanged. Silas stood beside him and listened. He said people often believed time only took things away. Youth, homes, chances, people we loved. But time also revealed. It wore paint from lies. It loosened what had been nailed shut. It carried buried details forward until someone patient enough noticed them. Caleb looked at the framed photograph. 8:18 in the corner, 9:18 on the wall. One wrong hour. On paper, it had looked like a technical mistake, a forgotten setting, a minor oversight. But that hour had taken a father from his son, a husband from his wife, a shop from its owner, and trust from a family that had done nothing to deserve losing it. Caleb had learned that small details were never small when powerful people built entire stories on top of them. A wrong hour could become a prison sentence. A flipped sign could become a clue. A frightened witness could become part of a lie. A child's question could become a key. And a clock no one bothered to examine could become the most honest witness in the room. Years later, people would still ask Caleb how he noticed what trained investigators, lawyers, and prosecutors had missed. He never liked the question. It made the answer sound like magic. There had been no magic. There had been prison visits, unpaid bills, library dust, pencil marks, sleepless nights, Marion's patience, Ruth's strength, Silas's lessons, and one child who refused to accept that a closed case meant a correct one. So Caleb answered simply. He noticed because his father had taught him to look at what everyone else dismissed. That was all. And that was everything. Injustice does not always arrive wearing a cruel face. Sometimes it arrives through hurry, through convenience, through a prosecutor who wants a clean victory, a lawyer too exhausted to ask one more question, a witness too frightened to correct the story, and a town too comfortable believing that the person closest to suspicion must be guilty. Justice does not always return with thunder. Sometimes it returns through an old woman reading records at a library table. Sometimes it returns through a mother who keeps standing after the world has taken almost everything. Sometimes it returns through a man who still believes broken things deserve care. And sometimes it returns through a 10-year-old boy standing on a wooden platform, asking an ordinary question that powerful adults were too certain to consider. The story of Silas and Caleb Turner was never proof that pain always carried a purpose. Pain did not become good simply because someone survived it. Nor was it proof that the system always corrected itself. Systems rarely correct themselves without people willing to disturb their comfort. The lesson was more honest than that. Never let confidence replace truth. Never allow authority to make you ashamed of asking a simple question. And never ignore a small detail, because powerful people are in a hurry to move on. Because somewhere, behind the person everyone is staring at, there may be a clock still pointing toward the truth. And sometimes, one honest question is enough to make the entire room finally hear it.